G'day, May 40 here. So if you go by the public polls, there is a trend over the past week, and the public polls show that Kamala Harris has momentum heading into the election. If you go by votes that have already been cast, there is reason to believe that Donald Trump is in a very good position. So there was one thing that jumped out at me in the 2016 election day, and that is in the morning of that Tuesday, I saw that black turnout was down in Philadelphia, and I was extrapolated that if black turnout overall in the United States is down, that would be very bad for Hillary Clinton's chances. And right now, going by early vote returns, there's substantial evidence that black turnout overall is down, and that would be quite bad for Kamala Harris. Out of everything I've read, out of everything I've seen, I think this analysis here by Mark Halperin from Friday afternoon is the most important.
Will be to continue to monitor to see whether she can actually win North Carolina, Georgia, or Arizona. Does not appear to my sources now that she will. Can she win the three Great Lakes states? And the focus has been on Pennsylvania.
Right. So the consensus that Mark Halperin has shared over the past 5 weeks is that Donald Trump has got the Sunbelt states, talking Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. However, if Kamala Harris wins the three Rust Belt states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, then she will likely win the election. But if she loses any one of those, then the odds are strong that Donald Trump will win.
Here on this platform, we did a 2-hour show called It's All About Pennsylvania. And what I'm here to tell you tonight, based on my reporting with Democrats and Republicans nationally and in both those states, that it could be that Kamala Harris wins Pennsylvania but loses the White House because she loses Wisconsin. Michigan remains a bit of a puzzle. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are doing dueling rallies near each other in Wisconsin tonight. Fitting, as far as I'm concerned, for my reporting, because as I said, my reporting is that she's in trouble in Wisconsin. This is based on 3 sources, 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat, all of whom know the state quite well, and all of whom told me today the same version of they would be somewhere between surprised and shocked if Kamala Harris won Wisconsin. Okay? Doesn't mean she's not going to. All I'm telling you is to reorient yourself away from news framing that says it's all about Pennsylvania. The winner of Pennsylvania will win this election. That's become kind of a mantra. The winner of Pennsylvania will win. I'm here to tell you, she may well win Pennsylvania and win the election, but she could win the Pennsylvania and lose the election because she doesn't win Wisconsin. Watch Wisconsin. Washington Post poll today of Pennsylvania, 48-47 Harris within the margin of error. On message, a Republican firm did some polling. Put that tweet up, please. It's a Republican firm, but they're very good pollsters. Alex Castellanos can testify to that. Very friendly with them. You put that up? Poll tweet? Yes, maybe. All right. A bunch of polls that show Trump ahead, but margin of error stuff. We can forget that. Now, big topic today. I've said this before. The only thing harder than running against Donald Trump is covering Donald Trump. It's very difficult to cover him, okay? Why is it difficult to cover him? The press doesn't like him in the main. As Jonathan Alter has said here, and others say regularly, he lies, he's cruel, he does things that no politician have ever done outside the norm, and you can't keep up with fact-checking him. However, the press, because they're liberally biased and because they don't like Donald Trump, they regularly do things that are wrong. They're taking something Trump did and they're twisting it. They do that to Kamala Harris too. They do that to Joe Biden. They do that to politicians. But you know, when I played high school basketball, my coach always told me an error in the first quarter is a mistake, a turnover is not as bad as a turnover or a missed shot in the fourth quarter because there's less time to make up for the error. Okay, 4 days out, the press doing something unfair that can have a real impact on the race. And we've seen in the last few days extraordinary unfairness to Donald Trump. Now, again, there are people on the left and people in the media who say, screw him. He must be stopped at all costs. And he lies so much. What does it matter? The calibration of our holding him accountable. And what I'm here to tell you is some of the things that happened in the last few days are extraordinarily unfair. Now, they may keep him from winning or they may backfire, as a lot of the unfairness in the press does. But because we're every day, we're moving so quickly with such great velocity, it really troubles me to see people in my profession commit malpractice. I'm rooting for Donald Trump. I'm not predicting he'll win. I'm just telling you, the malpractice on the part of the press in treating Donald Trump unfairly is a shame. It's a shame, okay? And it's not unnoticed in conservative circles, but it may keep Donald Trump from winning. The press may be committing massive in-kind contributions here. I'll say again, he needs to be held accountable, of course. Let me run through the examples. Okay, forget Madison Square Garden versus Joe Biden and the ways those were covered. That's a little harder to be fully clear on qualification, in quantitative and qualitative terms of just how unfair that was to Donald Trump. But believe me, it was. Here are things that are unambiguous. Tucker Carlson made about in the forever wars. Okay. He did not call for her assassination. He did not wish her to be shot. And the coverage in the dominant media is so up is down, down is up, that it's almost impossible for me to describe it to you. It couldn't be more unfair. Okay. Just if we want to talk about it when we open up the floor, we can. But it could not be more unfair. They have selectively edited what he said. They have mistaken the meaning. And I can't tell you, even though I've worked in these newsrooms, I can't tell you if they know what they're doing or not. In other words, if they're doing it on purpose or it's some sort of reflex. But it is outrageous, this close to an election, to take his words about the forever wars and the plain meaning he had. Now, you may say the way he expressed his position was too violent to suggest her facing guns, but he did not call for her assassination. He was making a point about the forever wars. And that is, by the way, an issue on which his position is more popular than a lot of Democrats. Okay. Number one. Number two, I'm going to show you a piece of video. This is a smaller example, but I want to show it to you. Donald Trump has brought some lawsuits, as have the Democrats, related to pre-election casting and counting. And you can say that all the lawsuits he fired in 2000, which were dismissed, many on procedural grounds, some on substantive grounds, demonstrate that he's not a good faith actor when it comes to election casting and counting litigation. But in 2024, he's won some of those cases. So here is a Washington Post version, kind of what some would call a poor man's version of two-way. Jonathan Capehart, Ruth Marcus, two liberals, and Hugh Hewitt, a conservative, talking about the cases that Trump has brought, which, by the way, as you'll hear Hugh Hewitt say, Trump won. Roll that, please.
The last umpty-ump months. No election can be fair unless in Donald Trump's mind, unless Donald Trump wins it. And I think we are going to see him both rev up his supporters to contest elections outside of courtrooms and go to every courtroom he can in America where it's relevant to make whatever arguments he can, no matter how far-fetched. We saw
Jonathan,
that
I've
work
got
out last time, but it didn't work out this time.
Finish,
It may not work. That may not happen this time. And now I'll let you go, Hugh.
Well, I've just got to say, we're news people, even though we're at the opinion section. It's got to be reported. Bucks County was reversed by the court and instructed to open up extra days because they violated the law and told people to go home. So that lawsuit was brought by the Republican National Committee, and it was successful. The Supreme Court ruled that Glenn Youngkin was successful.
Striking about Donald Trump's contestation of the 2020 election was how no good Republican lawyers would take his side. And this time, Donald Trump's team does have good lawyers on their side, and they are successful. Unfortunately, Donald Trump's abominable behavior after the 2020 election means that many people will not give him the benefit of the doubt.
We are news people, even though we have opinions, and we have to report the whole story if we bring up part of the story. So yes, he's upset about Bucks County, but he was right, and he won in court. That's the story.
I'll let you keep going, Jonathan.
No, I don't appreciate being lectured about reporting when many times you come here saying lots of things that aren't.
I won't come back, Jonathan. I'm done. I'm done. This is the most unfair election ad I've ever been a part of. You guys are working. That's fine. I'm done.
So, Ruth, you wrote a column this week ending with this line, and actually, I think this is perfect.
Okay. So I'm hoping to storm out like that on some episode of the morning meeting before Election Day, just so you know. But what's happening there? Hugh Hewitt is under the burden of dealing with two liberals who want to say Donald Trump's election litigation is a joke and it's part of his denialism. And Hugh's saying, well, in these two cases, not insignificant cases, it's not denialism. The courts have upheld Donald Trump's point of view.
So a lot of people are crazy in one situation and quite rational and make a lot of sense in other situations. It would be great if there was just a moral character that would shine through in all situations, in all of our interactions. But life is not that simple, right? Some people are faithful with their financial accounting, but unfaithful in their sexual. Other people are in a social setting, but you get them out, at a bar and behave bad. And so Donald Trump, horrible. Now
they mock him, and Hugh storms off. Again, small example. I showed it because the video is good, but it also illustrates the furor on the right about unfair treatment in the press.
Donald Trump deserves mockery for the way he conducted himself after the 2020 election. That doesn't mean that everything he does is equally deserving of that type of mockery.
Now, last example. Dominant thing in the press today, for the political press. David Plouffe, extraordinary credibility with the national press. Okay, David does a briefing for friendly reporters who cover the Harris campaign. And he says, he makes the assertion that undecided voters in the last few days have moved towards Kamala Harris. And that they've moved towards Kamala Harris because of the Madison Square Garden event. Now, that assertion seems questionable on the face, but if I were on the call, I would have demanded some proof, not just an assertion. It's a hard thing for a campaign to know. They would have to know that voters are saying, I'm switching from undecided to Harris, and I'm doing it because of Madison Square Garden. I don't know how the Harris campaign would know that. I take a lot of great analytics. But then he said, the profile of the undecideds, put up David Pluff's tweet, please. He also tweeted the same thing. The profile of the undecideds are better for Harris than for Donald Trump. It's helpful from experience to be closing a presidential campaign with late deciding voters breaking by double digits to you and the remaining undecideds looking more friendly to you than to your opponent. Closed rate turnout 4 days, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't mention the Madison Square Garden thing, but he said that on the call. Now, David's free to assert whatever he wants, but it is being written up like it's a fact. And I will tell you, the whole basis of the Trump campaign's confidence is their belief that the profile of the undecideds is 2-to-1 favorable to Trump. Now, they may not be telling the truth, although I've had detailed conversations with them about it for a long time, and I've seen it ostensibly how they're saying that. They may be right or they may not. It's not a small issue. And for David Plouffe to assert this is the bandwagon effect, right? We're not the underdogs anymore in the Harris campaign. Things are moving our way. Again, David has credibility, but the press is covering it with total credulity. Plouffe is right. Plouffe is right that the undecideds moved because of Madison Square Garden. Again, I doubt it's true that they moved because of Madison Square Garden. I doubt, maybe. And I doubt they know that. And I doubt that they know, I doubt the makeup of the undecideds, or as David says, respectfully doubt. So I asked Chris LaCivita, who's roughly David's counterpart at the Trump campaign, what he thought of David's two assertions, that Madison Square Garden has moved undecideds and that the remaining undecideds profile move towards or better for Harris and Trump. Here's what Chris told me. This is the profanity part. What the hell is he going to say? Speaking of David Plouffe, he's losing. Fact of the matter is, David can't do anything but bullshit until Tuesday because we are kicking his ass. The only thing the Harris campaign has functional at this point is a bullshit machine that is dutifully repeated by the legacy media as if fact. Okay. Now, the reason I'm raising this is part of this same sequence on this issue of unfairness to the Trump campaign by the dominant media that wants him to lose is they're pissed in Mar-a-Lago about how the press is treating Donald Trump's statement about Liz Cheney, how they treated the Madison Square Garden stuff. They're also pissed at how the press is treating another big one that is being completely mischaracterized, so much so that one CNN anchor even acknowledged it was being treated in a mischaracterized way. When Donald Trump said he would protect women even if they didn't want him to, he was not talking about abortion. He was talking about immigration. This is a series of unfair things that I just again, not rooting for Trump. I'm just telling you, it's unfair. It is unfair, and it is unfair in the fourth quarter of the game. Okay. Now, breaking news: Pennsylvania Supreme Court won't issue a definitive ruling before Election Day.
Election, and I find it very, very hard to believe to look at something like the Liz Cheney coverage, which I very much agree is incredibly unfair, and say, oh no, that's going to turn off voters. I would imagine a lot of the voters who are already going to be turned off by those sorts of things are probably not voting for Trump anyway, right? And so that tends to be my general sentiment. But I do think, regardless, it's really important to talk about just how unfair these sorts of things are, right? I mean, you mentioned the Liz Cheney point.
All right, here's an interesting burst from CNN.
A percentage of the public that thinks that the country is on the right track when the incumbent party loses. It's 25%. That 25% looks an awful bit like that 28% up there. It doesn't look anything like this 42% doesn't look anything like this 28%. So the bottom line is, very few Americans think the country is on the right track at this particular point. It tracks much more with when the incumbent party loses than with it wins. In fact, I went back through history. There isn't a single time in which 28% of the American public thinks the country is going on the right track in which the incumbent party actually won. They always lose when just 28% of the country believes that the country is on the right track. Now, we don't know if Kamala Harris is going to succeed Joe Biden, but we know back in 2008, George W. Bush, his approval rating was down in the 20s. Did a Republican succeed George W. Bush? No. How about in 1968? Lyndon Baines Johnson, his net approval rating was negative. Did a Democrat succeed Lyndon Baines Johnson? No. How about in 52? Harry S. Truman, his approval rating was in the 20s, if not the upper teens. Did a Democrat succeed Harry S. Truman in 52? My memory, no. No, as Kate Baldwin says.
Diana.
No. Diana. Republicans have been registering voters in big, huge numbers. They have been gaining in party registration versus the Democrats in the swing states with party registration. We're talking Arizona. I think it's a 5-point. They've expanded their lead from 5 points from where it was back in 2020. How about Nevada? Big Republican registrations there. They like the early vote. How about North Carolina? Big Republican registration gains. How about Pennsylvania? We spoke about it before a few months ago. Big Republican party registration gains versus from where they were.
So we're definitely.
Okay, so I'm right wing, I'm conservative, I'm a Trump supporter and a Trump voter, but I'm not rabid. I recognize that Donald Trump is a deeply flawed man and that in some situations, a left-wing politics will be more effective. For example, with regard to COVID, a strong public policy with regard to COVID, strong national health guidelines, all right, all sorts of generally left-wing activist government measures were more effective, at least in the early stages of preventing an influenza epidemic. So I recognize there are some situations where a left-wing response will be more adaptive. I just watched the movie The Apprentice about Donald Trump's relationship with Roy Cohn. Terrific movie. It rings true. It's you could see it as a devastating portrayal of Donald Trump. I thought it was a thoughtful portrayal of Donald Trump. But yeah, he's flawed, and I recognize that there are going to be all sorts of situations where you're going to say, "Oh my God, he's the wrong man for the job." So, Trump supporter, but I recognize that things are a little bit more complicated than just what I want to happen. All right, Chuck Todd is NBC News political director. Here he talks.
It doesn't feel like a guy trying to win. It feels like the guy trying to prove a point. And I it's too close of election. I think it's unless they see something we don't. And I would say this, the way Trump's been behaving, to me, I think you can see they're nervous.
Well, here we are just a few days out from one of the most consequential presidential elections, arguably in history, so who better to chew it all over with than NBC News' chief political analyst, former moderator of Meet the Press and host of the...
Well, what's outstanding is overall the lack of nerves and anxiety on the part of Republicans, on the part of Donald Trump's team compared to Kamala Harris's team. For weeks, you've had an increasing number of Republican political professionals express assurance that Donald Trump is going to win, and Mark Halperin has been unable to find any Democratic political professionals state with assurance that Kamala Harris is going to win. So nerves and anxiety are much more evident on the left side of the political spectrum in the United States right now.
The brilliant Chuck Toddcast. It's Chuck Todd. Chuck, welcome back to Times Radio.
Thank you, James. Good to be back.
I'm going to start with a question that you're probably fed up of. I imagine pretty much all your colleagues, friends, family members are asking you with just a few days to go. What is the state of the race? So
there's my elevator pitch answer, right? Because you're right. This is a fair question from my mother to all sorts of people. The data says this is a tie. And there's nothing in the data that indicates anything else. History says advantage Trump, meaning party out of power. The top two issues are issues that they believe Trump is better on, the border security and the economy. And sitting vice presidents running, trying to replace unpopular sitting presidents don't win. I mean, it doesn't happen often, but it doesn't win. You know, the last sitting vice president to win was George H.W. Bush, and the outgoing president had an approval rating over 60. But the last 2 weeks of this campaign, Harris has closed better than Trump. So it's one of those things. I think Harris has momentum here at the end.
So this is the general media consensus right now, is that Kamala Harris is closing well and that she is surging, but it's not clear if it will be enough to overcome Trump's early vote. Here is
We're undecided.
Fox News.
Here, people seem to know this round who they're voting for.
But former President Trump did better in Philadelphia in 2020 than he did in 2016, improving most in Philly's poorest neighborhoods. Republicans are knocking on doors and feeling good.
If we can get 20, maybe 30,000 more votes, we're going to win the state of Pennsylvania. People in Philadelphia, we're not rich here. Okay, the Bidenomics are killing us at the grocery store, and that's what I think it's all about.
Amid concerns about Latino and black voter turnout here, Harris is holding her last campaign event tomorrow night right in front of the iconic Art Museum steps, a concert here in Philadelphia. Dana?
Ryan Yanez, thank you so much. And Bill, kick us off at the billboard.
Dana, we've had a flood of polls over the past 24, 36 hours. Just going to tick through them quickly here. This is ABC News, he said, Sunday morning, plus or minus 2 points. This is nationally now. They've got Harris with a 3-point edge. We had Trump with a 2-point edge nationally in our Fox polling just about a week ago. All right, another one here. So just among the swing states, this is New York Times. This came out late last night, plus or minus 1.3 points, real small MOE there, which shows you.
It would be unusual if pollsters underestimate the Trump vote 3 elections in a row. They underestimated him in 2016 and in 2020. Are they doing it again?
Right. You know, Harris has a 1-point lead. But that could go either way based on the margin of error. This right here is, okay, this is the one that everybody was shooting around social media last night. This is the Des Moines Register in Iowa. This is Ann Selzer's poll. We can explain that in a moment here with Carl coming up here. In Iowa, Des Moines Register, plus or minus 3.4 points, okay? They've got a flip now. They had Trump up a month ago. They've got Harris up today by 3 points, 47-44. We can debate this, and we'll all find out come Tuesday how this holds up. It's also got a pretty good reputation. I'll bring Carl Rove in on that, and Dana as well, just to get us the lowdown. Carl, of the 3 things I just showed you, what stands out? What do you key on?
How tight it is. Think about this. This is inside the margin of error, and not just simply in the national polls. You can say somebody's ahead by 2 points nationally, but you know Hillary Clinton was ahead in the popular vote by 2.1, and she lost. But is the dynamic different this time around? And how these things are on knife's edge when we have polls showing us 1.2 point, or if you average them together in these states. Think about this. Pennsylvania, Real Clear Politics says Pennsylvania is 0.7% for Trump. 538 says 1/10 of 1% for Trump.
The key here is they're talking about public polls, which do not have the quality, and they don't have as much money put behind them. They're not as detailed as the private polls. Private polling has shown Donald Trump with a slim lead in Pennsylvania for the past few weeks.
And Silver Bulletin says 0.3 of 1%. And if that doesn't scare you, it's flatlined in Real Clear Politics and down for Trump from his previous numbers in both 538 in the Silver Bulletin.
And we can show you one more. This is USA Today, Suffolk poll. Kamala Harris 49, Donald Trump 49 in Pennsylvania. And that is likely Pennsylvania voters. I want to ask you about this Iowa poll. It's great to have you here to be able to explain it. This is one thing that Nate Silver said about it, that the poll had little effect on our top line electoral college numbers because Iowa has only a 1% chance of being the tipping point state. He also said that Ann Selzer, who put out the poll that showed Harris having momentum in Iowa, that it was gutsy for her to put the poll out because it is such an outlier,
right,
but she is an honest broker, and that's what she found.
Right. And look, she's a good pollster, but even great pollsters don't get it right each and every time. To me, the biggest thing about this poll is that it would show an 11-point shift from the outcome of the 2020 election, which would mean that roughly 1 out of every 5 people who supported Donald Trump in Iowa in 2020 would today be saying, I'm voting for Harris. And I think we'd feel that. So, we have an Emerson poll that shows, I think, a 7-point margin for Trump. He may be underperforming what he did 4 years ago, but he's not underperforming 11 points. We'd feel that 1 out of every 5.
And also, if Harris and Walz actually thought they could win Iowa, wouldn't they have actually made a visit?
But look, the last-minute polls tend to lead people to do weird things. You may remember our experience in 2004. There was one poll done in Hawaii that showed Bush, Cheney in striking distance, and the vice president said, I want to go to Hawaii, which he was on the final weekend. But, President Trump was in Salem, Virginia, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. There's no real evidence that either one of those states are close. Maybe an outlier poll or inside the campaign.
So you start to think Iowa has 6 electoral votes.
Right.
But, based on the battleground states, you can see a path for either one where Iowa, in the end, may not even matter.
Right.
But if I was thinking that way, and if that poll is correct, then you got to think, well, maybe Wisconsin is thinking that way as well. Just something to consider as we go into Tuesday night. Went back into history in 2020. In September of 2020.
Okay, let's have a look at the things I have bookmarked on X. Trump and Harris schedules tell the same story. Trump thinks Pennsylvania is solidly behind him, so he can go to Wisconsin, Virginia, New Hampshire, and shore up North Carolina. Harris thinks Pennsylvania requires almost all of her time in the final days. Men attend the most prestigious universities and women the least. Look at the latest U.S. News rankings. The top schools are 50-50 men and women. The lowest ranked schools, usually about 55 to 75% women. The for-profit schools are about 70% women. Men don't go to lower-tier colleges. They don't go to for-profit colleges. They don't study low-value majors as much as women. Most women that are only minimally qualified for college still go, but minimally qualified men go into trades or sales or start a business. And this is a provocative tweet. Turns out that pervert is a meaningful category, not just a prudish hate word. All sexual targeting disorders are comorbid, right? Having any one of them significantly increases the probability that you will also have others targeting. I think that's self-explanatory when you go after people for your sexual satisfaction in a predatory way. Or sexual targeting disorders probably have minor variations on a single minimal brain damage syndrome affecting the specific portions of the limbic system that relate to arousal and desire. This is one of the things that the libertarian me was extremely annoyed to discover. Social conservatives have been right all along. The reason for their beliefs was usually insane. It was God. Yet, if we let homosexuals fly their freak flag freely, significant percentage of them will come after your children. I would say if we let heterosexuals fly their freak flag freely, that a significant percentage of them will also come after the underage and will violate the law in all sorts of ways. I think the Talmud says that the penis is the one muscle that, right, the more you exercise it, the more demanding it gets. And when we say it's okay to make sexual satisfaction your top priority, sexual promiscuity is socially acceptable, then you don't just get sexual promiscuity within an ethical framework, right? The more you let heterosexuals, homosexuals let their freak flag fly, the more you're going to have predatory antisocial behavior.
20, that same poll in Iowa would have a 11 to 12 point swing in such a short period of time.
I don't think so. That's why I discount this one. And look, we got, as you say, they've got plenty to say grace over. They've got 7 states that everyone acknowledges are battleground states and which everyone acknowledges are close. If you take a look at, again, these 3 averages, Real Clear Politics, 538, and Silver Bulletin, there's not a single state that is greater than 2.5%. Excuse me, 2.9%. I mean, there are 4, you think about that, 7 battleground states times 3 averages, 21 data points. 4 of those are 2% to 2.9. 7 are 1 to 1.9 separating the 2 candidates, and 10 of them have less than 1% separating them. This is a tight election. These are all within, in essence, the margin of error.
Is this the closest election you've ever either been a part of or reported on?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's not only the closest to me. The other thing is how remarkably stable it's been. I put this in my Wall Street Journal column Thursday. Think about it. Between September 25th and last Wednesday, she dropped 0.3% in the national average, and he grew 0.9%. And I mean, we're used to elections where, Reagan debates Carter and there's a 7 or 8 point switch. We're used to these things where in September and October. Think about this.
Okay, the Trump campaign still sounds very confident, and you don't hear the same level of confidence from Kamala's campaign. A few more of my bookmarks on X. It's not just Matt Drudge spewing this blatant, insane lie, says Glenn Greenwald. It pervades most of the corporate media and the liberal pundit class. It was obviously motivated by hating Trump. And you've got this crazy headline here on Drudge: Trump calls for Liz Cheney's execution, when in fact Trump was talking about that all these supporters of war usually don't want to go serve themselves or have their children go serve. It's one of the most pathetic media lies about Trump in a while. Trump was making the valid and important point that, like many in Washington, D.C., Liz Cheney is a maniacal warmonger because it's never her or her dad that endures the horrors of war. It's an example of how the news distorts things.
4 days out from Election Day, and former President Donald Trump is escalating his violent rhetoric, suggesting one of his most prominent critics, the former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, should be fired upon.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. When the guns are trained on her face. They're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy.
Let's see how she feels when the guns are trained on her face.
Okay, that's absurd that he was threatening Liz Cheney. Russell Warren says, I published an essay in Quillette yesterday about why reporting on intelligence is so bad. Techniques used to engineer a narrative that makes intelligence research look bad. Journalists often do a terrible job talking about intelligence, why the distorted view of IQ gets perpetuated. It's about the most useful tool you have for understanding the world around you. What about the disappearance of weird as a put down of the Trump campaign? You saw it everywhere for a couple of weeks. And then it completely died out. It was totally coordinated, but it didn't land. The persuasion kill shot only works if there's some truth to it. J.D. Vance is not weird. Trump is weird in a good way, as in a totally unique personality. They want to talk about creepy. That only describes Tim Walz. Anna Kasparian of the Young Turks has moved towards the center. She notes fascism requires a militarized citizenry, conquest and imperialism, the elimination of our governing bodies like Congress, and the notion that anyone who isn't part of a master race should be massacred. It's a weird thing to label a guy who brags about not starting any new wars. He also passed criminal justice reform. He personally pardoned black inmates who were serving life sentences for drug crimes who Obama was unwilling to pardon. Yeah, the claim that Donald Trump is a fascist is just self-evidently absurd. Right? The man loves nothing more than a good fight. He would be bored if he didn't have people to fight with. And Steve Saylor notes, Trump would make a pretty poor fascist. Central to fascism's appeal in the 1930s was disgust over controversy. Right? Europeans back in the 1930s worried that the dignity and the power of the state was being undermined by the incessant open controversy over politics, and thus national security was threatened. So in 1933, American journalists began attributing a wry observation to the long-dead Bismarck. Laws are like sausages. It's better not to see them made. To retain respect for sausages and laws, one must not watch them in the making. And so in the 1930s, many Europeans felt it was better if their rulers issued commands from on high and left the political sausage making behind the scenes. So for all those who think that Trump is a fascist, really? Isn't Trump by nature and practice the American least likely to bring less controversy and more august dignity to the political process? There's an amusing New York Times front page column, How Will White Women Vote? It's a question with a fraught history. And it's by Nikole Hannah-Jones. She's the one who came up with the 1619 Project. So Steve Saylor notes, amateur crank historian Nikole Hannah-Jones is founder of the hilariously racist award-winning 1619 Project about how the true founding of America was when blacks arrived. New York Times executive editor Dean Baquet promoted her heavily when the New York Times Plan A to get rid of Trump, Russiagate, created in 2019. So Baquet switched to his Plan B, racism, 24/7. So when black women vote for one party at a level, say 98%, right, that's democracy. But when white women are closely split, that's just racist fascism. And Nikole Hannah-Jones says white women essentially must subordinate their interests to those of black women. After all, black gets capitalized by the New York Times and white does not. So that morally, the uncapitalized must bow down to the capitalized. We'll know the Great Awakening is truly over when the press stops capitalizing one race but not the other, as almost all of them have been doing since the collective media psychotic break of the summer of 2020. The Washington Post is a rare exception that went on to capitalize both. I wouldn't be surprised if owner Jeff Bezos put his thumb on the scale to get both races treated equally in the Washington Post style guide. In 2020, you had to have $100 billion to favor Black Lives Matter. Even in 2024, nobody has rolled back Black Lives Matter craziness. All right, let's get a little bit more here from Chuck Todd.
I think Trump has sort of the mood music on his side, and the data is predicting this sort of what I call an uncomfortable crash landing, where it's as close as you can be in every one of these states, and it really is on a knife's edge. So there could be polling error, but I actually don't know if it's polling error. I actually think it's simply the final voters are impossible to poll. If you don't like either one of these candidates and you've decided you're going to vote, think about your own life. When you have to do something you don't look forward to, do you do it early or do you do it at the last possible minute? And I think that ultimately that's where I think we are. I think we are sort of at perfect political parity, P-A-R-I-T-Y. It could turn into parody with a D, but that's, we'll see.
It's interesting you mentioned the polling. I wanted to get your thoughts on something I've heard a few people say, including, I was interviewing the other week the former UK cabinet minister, one of our big political podcasters now in the UK, Rory Stewart, who said that he thinks the polling companies may have got this wrong and that they have overcorrected from when they underestimated Trump's level of support in 2016 and 2020. And he thinks it's feasible. He actually thinks it's quite likely that Kamala Harris may win this quite comfortably and people will be surprised. Do you think there's something in that?
So, look, I know this theory well, and I know what these pollsters have been doing. It is a different way that we, do we think we have a better, our polling is better now than it was before? We do. We match it to the voter file. We're very careful. We don't do any more random digit dialing sampling anymore. We don't do panel surveys. I think panel surveys, which a lot of the polling that you're seeing out there is done via panel, and not to get too wonky, but that is basically people who want to be polled. And so you already have a bias of essentially a selection bias, if you will. So I'm always very nervous about those panel surveys as well. Look, there's two ways to look at polling error, and I don't think you cannot assume it goes in one direction. So the fact of the matter is we missed a piece there. To me, I'm not even 100% convinced it's polling error in 16 and 20. I do believe the last minute Trump voter waits till the last minute. Both things can be true. There's certain voters you can't poll. So a poll can both be accurate and not have the right breakdown, because there's a chunk of voters where the undecided vote doesn't split 55-45, it splits 85-15. And again, I go back to that last minute voter. I believe the last undecided voter is a Republican who doesn't like Trump. Well, if you're a Republican who doesn't like Trump, you're probably a bit uncomfortable with a liberal Democrat as president, and you're vacillating. But I also believe that's a tough person to actually find in the poll. Now, let's take this polling error issue. It all depends on how you corrected for Trump. I can tell you how we corrected for Trump. We corrected for Trump by double checking that, making sure that instead of weighting up our rural sample, we made sure we got enough interviews so that we weren't weighting as much. If you are weighting too much your young voters and you weight too much your rural voters, who are the two hardest to poll demographics, well, the minute you start weighting up, let's say you only got 80 young voters, but it needs to be a 250 in your sample, and you're weighting up that 80. Well, you can really create some exponential error as you weight that into the sample. There's also a bit of concern. It's not just about did we overcorrect on Trump. The other concern are pollsters afraid of being wrong, so they're hurting, and they're making sure their top line looks like a close.
Okay, so the New York Times political director, James Blair, is talking there live with Fox News, and about 5 minutes behind the actual.
What do we know? James Blair might know a few things. Political director, RNC, Trump campaign. James, good morning to you. Just give us your state of the race right now. What does your campaign see?
We're very optimistic right now. We feel good about where things are. Right now, obviously, what we're watching is people are voting. And what we've seen is historic early voting by Republicans outperforming 2020 or even 2022. So from our perch, things look pretty good right now. I'm sure we'll go through state by state, but some highlights. North Carolina, we won the early vote. That's never happened before. In Nevada, the mail dumps are coming in, and they're not as blue as the Democrats would like them to be. And there's not as many of them. So lots of good signs in our direction right now.
Okay, I want to read this from Nate Cohn. This is on the New York Times polling that I showed our viewers here. Across these final polls, white Democrats were 16% likely to respond than white Republicans. That's a larger disparity than our earlier polls this year, and it's not much better than our final polls in 2020, even with the pandemic over. It raises the possibility that the polls could underestimate Mr. Trump yet again. We do a lot to account for this, but in the end, there are no guarantees. How do you read that?
I think it's covering. I think that they know where things stand. Look, in all of those polls, in all the battleground states, I heard Carl before this talking about the recalled vote, they've set the electorate to the left of 2020, which doesn't comport with what we know, which is that all of these electorates have moved to the right just on a registration eligible electorate basis itself. And obviously we see that starting to manifest in the early voting pattern. So I think that they're sort of putting some cover out there because they're going to underrepresent President Trump's support. What they essentially are saying there is we got too many Democrats in the survey. We don't have enough Republicans. We know that, but we're going to publish these numbers on the eve of the election anyway.
So the pollsters have told us that they've accounted for this because the miss in 16, the miss in 2020. We'll see whether or not that happens. Wall Street Journal has been a big target for your campaign. Young men could boost Trump to victory if they show up. That's the headline. What are you seeing out there in the battlegrounds?
Well, let's just talk about the partisan registration states where they register by party, because then you don't have to take my word for it. You can go look for yourself. Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Republicans have turned out more 0 of 4 voters and 1 of 4 voters, so those less frequent or newly registered voters than the Democrats have in every single one of those states. So I'd say that there's evidence that it's working on our part. We are turning out those lower propensity voters, be they young men or otherwise. So everything you can measure right now suggests that it's going well for us.
My sense is on Tuesday, we're going to be spending a lot of time in Pennsylvania. Maybe that's right, maybe it's wrong. But this 8 years ago, this is Trump winning that state by 44,000 votes over Hillary Clinton. 4 years ago, this is Biden winning the state by 81,000 votes in 2020. We'll see. But it's just my sense that the Keystone State will be very critical and key come Tuesday. How much can your campaign do in the closing 48 hours?
A lot. We can keep getting out the vote. And let's talk about Pennsylvania. Right now, there's nearly 700,000 registered Democrats in the state of Pennsylvania who had cast a vote by this point in 2020 or 2022, and they haven't cast a vote yet, and they don't have mail ballots. That's a huge hurdle for them to climb. Secondarily, again, we've talked about the voter registration before, Bill, but just to put a fine point on it, there was 685,000 more registered Democrats in the state of Pennsylvania 4 years ago than Republicans. Today, that number's been cut to about 280,000. So huge swing in our direction.
James Blair, thank you for your time. I know you're working day and night. Thanks for coming on today, and we'll see who's right. Thanks.
Okay, I understand my mic was garbled. How does it sound now? Here's a video of a woman with severe Trump derangement syndrome, Patty Baris, former senior Department of Defense official, and she starts screaming at a conservative woman in a coffee shop.
So I called it right. And am I a liberal? Do I disagree? Are you a Democrat? Yes, I am. Okay, so the only people, so I work for the only people who ever challenged
why did you do
the only people who ever shut the word educated women. Listen, it means that you understand what someone is a convicted felon, a sex offender, and accused of espionage, indicted for espionage. Like I said, the only people who ever challenged it are white Democrat women. I am a 35-year national national security expert.
Oh, you're so smart.
Who you are? Okay.
Stop.
Everybody
can
believe in what they want to believe. No.
Thank you.
Will you tell her we were having a private conversation before she came over in my face saying, am I serious? So no, don't talk to me. Talk to her. You and I already know. You and I already know who is the one. Yeah, you and I already know. So take your attention right over here.
I think Trump voters would be far less likely to start hectoring some stranger about how they're voting or getting into these unnecessary public arguments. You're never going to win in something like that. Trump voters don't feel overall that people who vote Democrat are just evil people or bad people. All right, Republicans simply think that Democrats are wrong, but what you see so widespread on the part of the left is that they're absolutely convinced that Republicans are not just wrong, but they are evil. Yeah, big Republican lead in the early vote in North Carolina. So Trump wins North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, as he seems sure to do, right? Then Kamala would have to absolutely sweep the Rust Belt states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and things look quite dire for her in Wisconsin.
This race. And I can tell you, I have found a bunch of evidence that pollsters are doing this because the demographics won't make sense. You'll be like, okay, you got a 49-49 tie, but you got that tie because you have Kamala Harris winning some Republican group and you have Donald Trump winning some Democratic group. Like, you're and that to me is always a clue that they played with the numbers because they didn't like the original top line that they got. So I'm getting a little wonky here, and I apologize, but I think if there's polling error and we've overcorrected for Trump, then it will look more like this campaign could look more like 2020 or 2012, where it's certainly close but decisive is what I would call that, right? Less than 5 points to me is still a close race nationally, but it was Obama had a decisive victory over Romney, and Biden had a decisive, by the Electoral College standards, victory over. Now, what if we're still missing the Trump vote? Okay, well, that's also his voters, particularly the new ones he's been courting. Working class men of color, they're very hard to poll. And if that's the case, then he wins comfortably. So, we are all on the lookout for polling error. We'll find it pretty quickly in the first battleground state that we start getting data in, which will be North Carolina.
It's interesting you said a moment ago, Chuck, that you think Kamala Harris is closing the better of the two candidates.
I do, yeah.
I wonder what you make of the way the Trump campaign is closing. I mean, particularly that big rally the other day in Madison Square Gardens. What was that about?
So we hear a lot about how Donald Trump was just a vastly unpopular U.S. president, but we don't hear so much about how Joe Biden is a highly unpopular president. And at this point, right, in their office. 58% of people right now disapprove of Joe Biden. Donald Trump had a 51% disapproval rating. Joe Biden had a 41% approval rating this time, and Trump had a 48% approval rating. Let's get some analysis here from NBC
We
News.
have been waiting for, what does this poll show us?
Yeah, I mean, fittingly, isn't it? At the very end, we find a tie nationally. 49% for Harris, 49% for Trump. Really, that's what we found when we last polled this a couple weeks ago. We go under the hood here and look at some of the other numbers there. There's this question of enthusiasm. A couple notable things here. This is the share of voters who are calling themselves very interested in this election. And you can see it stands at 77%, which is down from 2020 when we had that historic turnout. Also, interestingly here, the interest is lower among Hispanic voters and black voters. Typically, you would say that is bad news for Democrats. But this year, keep in mind, among black voters, that could be very troubling for the Democrats. But among Hispanic voters, the Trump folks are hoping for big strides. They've been seeing that in the polls. If that does not translate into Election Day.
So we saw with gay marriage that blacks, by and large, were not down with gay marriage. I suspect that a substantial part of the Latino community is not down with the state paying for transgender surgeries for criminals and illegal aliens.
Votes, that could be trouble for them. Then we come to the issues that voters say that matter most to them and how they rate the candidates. And I think, again, notably, Harris continues to do best on abortion, 20-point advantage there. Trump continues to do best on inflation, cost of living, an advantage there of 12.
This is something to watch on Election Day because, of course, she's actually doing better on.
So with Donald Trump so much better on the economy, according to the polls, and with regard to immigration, and given the record level unpopularity of the current Biden administration, it would be unprecedented for Kamala Harris to win this type of election. Throughout the First World, we are seeing incumbent administrations getting tossed out at the polls.
On abortion than Trump is doing on inflation and cost of living. We'll have to see how that pans out with the voters.
Absolutely. And we can continue and take a look here. This other issue, we've talked about it in our last poll, too, the dueling approval ratings. This is sort of an albatross for Harris here. Her administration that she's a part of, Joe Biden's approval rating sits at just 41%. And then there's this twist. Donald Trump, retrospectively, do you now approve of how he did as president? In our poll, 48%, almost half, give him that approval rating.
And we have to pause again because 48% is higher than the approval ratings he was getting when he was president, Steve. Really striking to see that.
Exactly. So is that a hidden advantage there for Trump in some way? Then there's this question, too. We just hear all the stories, all the images from early voting. And look at this. 2/3 of voters in our poll say they've either voted already or they're going to vote early. On Election Day, 1/3 of the electorate actually saying they will turn out and vote then. And you can see, we saw a bit of this in 2020, remember, the early vote here, more Harris-friendly in our poll. That Election Day vote, that's the big wild card. You don't know what that turnout will look like on Election Day, but if Trump has an advantage there, see if it's enough to overcome what he could potentially lose in the early side. And then the gender gap. Again, we've talked about this throughout the.
All right, let's get more from Chuck Todd, NBC political director, who does a pretty good job of trying to be fair.
Did he need to do that? Was it just about Donald Trump wants the glory of playing Madison Square Garden in his home city?
Yeah.
Or is there something else going on there?
I think that, look, this is him. He's always wanted one, and they wanted to do it. He's an event guy, okay? He doesn't, he's not a sort of, but I do find it ironic here. I have had this theory on this election that it's going to be 2016 in reverse, meaning in 2016, a whole bunch of voters had just decided, you know what, I don't want her as president. I'm not crazy about this guy, but at least it's different. Let's try it. And I think and that's why, I've always been I think there was some polling error, but I think a lot of this was a whole bunch. I think the late decider almost uniformly went Trump. And remember how that campaign closed, James. Donald Trump spent his final days in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Hillary Clinton was spending money in Texas, Arizona, Florida. She was looking for the 400 electoral vote victory. Sound familiar with what you just described? Where's Kamala Harris this week? Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Donald Trump's done Madison Square Garden. He's going to campaign in New Mexico. He's going to have a rally in Virginia. New Mexico and Virginia are competitive but not close. There's a difference, meaning that they're single-digit states. Look, just like with Hillary Clinton.
Right, but if people consume election information primarily through their screens, it doesn't matter so much where the campaign rally is, right? It depends on the quality of the campaign rally. I'm not sure it's particularly decisive whether it takes place in a battleground state or not.
Explain that in politics, a good rule of thumb is don't say you want to do anything like Hitler.
Or Puerto Rico, where I'm in my home state of Delaware, they're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
Donald Trump, you never see him around strong, intelligent women, ever. It's just that simple. They're intimidating to him. He doesn't like to be challenged by them.
So my assumption is that none of those people wrote that ad, right? I mean, that's the opposite of unity. Robert, does it sell?
So here's the way I would frame it. I think the first 90 days, it was the ads for her were to define herself, defend herself, and attack the Trump policies. I think the last 30 days has been all about contrast. So it doesn't surprise me that she put out a unity type ad. But when you're talking about a sprint election for the vice president, not someone that's been running for 9 months, it doesn't surprise me that you actually shift very quickly to where the contrast is. Because we know 80%'s a choice election. I like that ad a lot. It shows a contrast. It shows that really she's going after.
You can find all these blog posts and news articles on how Mark Cuban makes the case for Kamala Harris better than Kamala Harris can. But one thing with Mark Cuban is he's also always saying really stupid things.
A lot of the Nikki Haley voters.
Here's another contrast. Call for a 3. This is.
Why is Kamala so desperate for Nikki Haley voters? All right, that seems like a desperate play. All right, much of Kamala's campaign the past 2 weeks feels desperate, while Trump's campaign feels confident.
Donald Trump's latest ad. Guy Benson, get you to reply.
We know what they think of us. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
So if Donald Trump can get through all of that, we can get out to vote.
So the deplorable garbage people, they stick together. And how do you think this is going into the last 48 hours?
Well, I think the ad from her is aimed at last-minute, undecided, independent types. That ad from him is trying to boost turnout among his base on Election Day.
Does he need that?
Well, I think you do need, if you're the Republicans, a big turnout on Election Day from Republican voters. As has been expected for a long time, you actually have to materialize those voters to swamp whatever advantages Democrats may or may not have built up in some of the early voting. So I think both in some ways make sense for each campaign. With the Democrats, and for all the reasons you pointed out, I think it's just ridiculous for them to be talking about unity, having screamed Hitler, Nazi, fascist garbage for days. But this is what they're trying to do to appeal to a specific type of person to try to win them over, whereas Trump is trying to goose the core base to say those low propensity voters who would prefer him to be president, please come out. We need you Tuesday.
If she wins, you wonder how his voters react. I mean, they've been called garbage and all this other stuff that you just read.
Well, Trump's voters have a lot of other things in their life aside from politics, right? Most Trump voters put their priority on their family, on their friends, on their community, on their work. So let's get a little more analysis here from Chuck Todd.
If she's winning Texas, it's over. Sure. If he's winning New Mexico, Virginia, sure. But he's also winning everything else. There is a part of me that thinks that the voter this time says, I've seen that presidency. I haven't seen that one. And that Harris could benefit from the very same thing Trump benefited from in 2016, when you had candidates who weren't comfortable with either candidate. They're going to pick new over same. And Trump's not new anymore. And that's why he's been trying to close against Biden, really tie Harris to Biden. If you're thinking about Joe Biden going into that polling booth, that's bad news for Kamala Harris. But if you're thinking about Donald Trump going into that voting booth, then suddenly Kamala Harris looks like change. So I do question these. Put it this way. If he loses, this is how Republicans will criticize the Trump campaign, saying they had a terrible close. He had a great close in 2016, a terrific close in 2016. He was a bit more disciplined. That's when he pulled back on the birtherism. Remember, he was really trying to normalize himself. Dare I say he was trying to win. Right now, it doesn't feel like a guy trying to win. It feels like the guy trying to prove a point. It's too.
That just seems way off to me. There's nothing in Trump's choices that indicate to me that he doesn't want to win. Right? He's going to go to jail if he doesn't win.
Is that just desperation?
Well, now you have singled out what will be the great criticism of her if she loses. And I've been hearing this criticism. There's a lot of Democrats that think she would be better off spending her time in Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Charlotte, turning out voters that are all that if they show up are going to be her voters, people of color, urban voters, etc. So there's been, but their theory of the case is they don't win unless they get this Nikki Haley crossover voter. And you're not going to get the Nikki Haley voter on substance. They don't like the Democratic economic policies. They want tougher border security. So but the one thing where you see some agreement on is Trump really is sort of doesn't fully follow the Constitution. This is troubling. So it's their theory of the case. Ironically, and I think this is worth noting, how Harris is closing is much different than how every House and Senate Democrat is closing. They're all closing on abortion rights, actually Social Security, protecting that, worrying about abortion rights. In some cases, a defensive ad or two on the border. They're not touching January 6th. They're not touching the democracy issue. They're focused more on those three more substantive issues. Now, I might argue a down ballot candidate is more likely to do that anyway, regardless of.
No, that's really weird that the leading Democratic candidates for public office, aside from Kamala Harris, are running on a different platform from Kamala Harris. I mean, how many people seriously think that calling Trump a fascist and making January 6th a key part of your message is going to be a winning message? Doesn't ring true to me. Let's get Rich Baris, right, talking here on November 1st. He's known as the People's Pundit.
Independents in this country. They are mostly partisan-leaning independents. And when let's say, and we are seeing higher turnout rates in places like Arizona and Nevada for Republicans, when that happens, it tends to drag that party's partisan-leaning independent bloc with it. So if you bring out a more Republican-leaning independent electorate because your side is more enthusiastic and energized, the margin among independents is going to be better for you than if the reverse or it was an even split occurred. So you take Arizona, Nevada. She will need to pluck off more of Trump's base and Kerry Lake's base.
I'll be absolutely shocked if Trump loses Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia. I'd not be shocked if he loses Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
Then is vice versa, which, absolutely could happen, but then also a massive margin with independents. Here's the truth. For years, people like me and others have been saying, look, this isn't 2020 anymore. Look at the registration trends. Look in Pennsylvania. Look in Nevada. Look in Arizona. Look in North Carolina. This is going the wrong way for Democrats. And I lived in Florida for more than 15 years, and I remember when that was a razor-thin battleground state. And that time from, even before 16, but even, going into the Trump administration, the gains that Republicans were making in voter registration were eventually going to lead to what I always like to call kind of like a political event horizon. You get to a point where you no longer can build your early vote firewalls. You can no longer sustain a swing that's not enough in your favor among independents because you have lost your registration edge. Going into 2020, Arizona was actually one of only two states where Democrats had really seen and made up significant gains in voter registration. And now it's R+7, that state. That is the largest advantage Republicans have ever had in the state. And Maricopa, by the way, is back to it's slightly more Republican than it was when Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in 2016. So what I really want people to understand is that some of this has been going on, and it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a period of a long time. And
all right, Patrick Healy, New York Times editor, longtime political reporter, looked at results from various focus groups that the New York Times conducted. And here's the main takeaway. Independents, Republicans, and Democrats preferred how America was under Donald Trump. They liked the economy, the perception of relative global stability, the restraint of divided government, and the image that this outsider businessman was not beholden to Washington insiders, lobbyists, and big money. There are plenty of things they did not like about Donald Trump, but those did not matter as much. Then COVID happened. Americans wanted a more stable leader. Listening to all these voters, I can't help but feel that Donald Trump would have been reelected in 2020 if not for COVID.
And then eventually you hit that event horizon. Democrats hit it in Florida, and that state is gone for them. North Carolina is moving in that direction. Arizona, we're going to find out, because this lead is very big. In fact, Donald Trump had far fewer, or I would say a far smaller advantage in the early vote going into 16 against Hillary Clinton than he does.
And back to Patrick Healy says if Kamala Harris loses, two biggest reasons will be the economy and Joe Biden insisting on running for re-election. Americans want change, big time. And that would mean electing Trump.
Does have now. Now, independents used to be, kind of more middle of the road. They tend to lean to the left in Arizona now because Republicans have just turned a lot of independents into Republicans. But still, that is a very big lead.
You know what?
That is a very big lead.
Can we talk? Can I keep you for one more segment if you don't mind? Not even anything else to do.
All right, back to Patrick Healy says, in our 2024 focus groups, the enthusiasm among many Republicans and independents for Donald Trump, or at least his ability to make the economy better, has been much more intense and constant. Maybe Democratic leaders never appreciated the depth of hurt or hunger for change. It looks as if Democratic leaders and Joe Biden aides committed textbook political malpractice by circling the wagons around a diminished incumbent president, Joe Biden, to clear the way for him to run for re-election, thus sandbagging his vice president and other Democrats from running a full-out race. There's something else that the Democrats have misread. Right? The party is in for a rude awakening over illegal immigration. People in our focus groups are upset about their cost of groceries, the cost of rent, healthcare, their inability to keep their head above water. Right? They don't see the America of their youth anymore, and they see a ton of government support going to help illegal migrants with little being done to seal the border. Illegal immigration is both a threat to the security of the country and a proxy for the political upheaval, economic difficulty, and social and demographic change that disturbs them. Right? The bulk of people's frustration with regard to immigration is falling on Joe Biden and the Democrats. Right? More people than Democrats realize want something serious, even draconian, done to remove undocumented migrants and to secure the border. If it takes an authoritarian Trump administration to do it, then so be it. The degree of their anger can be unsettling to contemplate. Here's a hard truth about America. A majority of voters have said the country is on the wrong track for 20 years now. Listen to our focus groups, you get the chilling sense that sooner or later the country is going to crack. This could look like Donald Trump getting reelected this week and using any means he can, perhaps including the military, rounding up illegal immigrants, putting them in militarized camps, deporting them, with more Americans than you would think going along with it. This would redefine our society. Among our focus group voters, there is a clear desire for a strong leader who takes charge of the country and puts it on a better course. Many of them see Donald Trump able to deliver. I get a little bit more here from Rich
here in
Baris.
Arizona, about 350,000 sat out. So yeah, I want you to explain that.
Okay. I do nothing but obsess over the numbers, Garrett. And I sit in the voter files all day. And, after 2020, when everybody was boo-hooing about, election irregularities, which I'm not even going to put down, there certainly were some. All I could think to myself was, if Republicans did it's not sexy work, so people don't want to talk about it, but if they did the hard work, registering these voters, getting the no and low prop, which is propensity, no propensity and low propensity voters to get on the permanent absentee ballot list, bank them, get them out of the way, and then keep their most reliable voters for election day if they're dying to vote on election. If they did that, the numbers are just that. It doesn't matter what Democrats do. Now, everyone has this, and it's unfortunate that this is gets a lot of attention and fanfare on the right. There's this false sense that they could just keep doing stuff and keep feeding things through the scanner. And that's just not the case. There is a finite universe of voters, and Republicans had a wealth of targets that they never hit. They don't engage with them. Their get out the vote was awful. It's, of course, obviously much better this year. Most of it is being handled by third-party groups, actually. But if they did that, Garrett, then it wouldn't matter if there was a pipe burst in Fulton County or...
Right, back to Patrick Healy writing in the New York Times. The idea of being uncomfortable in America was at the heart of two focus groups. Right, one was a group of conservative men. The other was a group of transgender Americans. There are many differences between the two groups. What unites them is a desire to feel themselves in America, open and proud about who they are without being criticized or ostracized by other people, enjoying freedom of speech, freedom to think, freedom to be who you are, freedom to be left alone. What happened to my country? Both groups were asking.
It's like none of that would matter. The numbers are overwhelming. I'll never, forget a conversation I had with Matt Brainerd after he got his hands on these voter files. He's like, how did we lose? How do we lose, Rich? And the simple answer to that is Democrats are much better at chasing ballots, and if Republicans want to win, they have to chase them too. And just to give you an idea of how well they've done, and we were talking about firewalls and this and that last segment, John Ralston, who I just brought up on the last segment from Twitter, as you and I were talking, put up a tweet. Basically, you can see him lamenting because he is leftist.
I saw it.
Yeah. And it's not getting through his and other people's thick heads. You cannot build a firewall if you do not have a registration advantage. And he just saw the latest update from the Nevada Secretary of State, and Republicans registered 10,000 more voters than Democrats.
Here's an interesting analysis of that outlier Seltzer poll out of Iowa that shows Kamala Harris ahead in Iowa. Seltzer uses random digit dialing and weights very little with a very simple likely voter model. That is, are you going to vote? No education weight, no partisan 2020 weight. This is very different from most pollsters these days. And Republican pollster Kristen Soltis Anderson says if the Seltzer polls is right this time, this is the polling equivalent of the Battlestar Galactica being the only ship in the fleet to not use the super new fancy technology. And that's exactly why it's the only ship to survive the initial attack of the Cylons. Not up on my Star Trek.
Democrats in the final month of the campaign. That's it. It's done. And now he's expecting all of these Clark mail-in ballots to come. And Republicans actually won the last drop last night. They're not coming. He doesn't get it. They don't have it. It's not in the tank. It's the same thing that happened to Florida. For years, everyone operated under the assumption that Democrats had 3, 6, 8-point turnout advantages because they had those registrations, but they don't have them anymore. And by the way, the work is not done yet. Looking at Michigan, there was 1.7 million of these people that I identified, and the target was to try to get about 300,000 of them out. So far, 380,000 of them have voted. I mean, imagine if that work had begun earlier, Garrett.
Yeah.
And, a million.
So National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has a hot wife, and she is running for Congress. And here she's the hottie on the left. The Republican is on your right.
This is a worldview that my opponent has embraced. She believes that we should give a break to the wealthiest and the biggest corporations and hope for the best, hope that the results will trickle down to hardworking people. I take a very different approach. I believe that the middle class deserves a tax cut, and I believe that we will do a lot for this country by ensuring that we don't continue this disastrous tax policy.
Ms. Tong-Williams.
You are wealthy. You are worth $20 million to $30 million. How do you know about regular people suffering? Do you go shopping, go to Walmart, buy food? I talk to those people. And you pretend to be renter in Nashua a few months ago, move back to run for this open seat with millions of dollars from Washington, D.C. insiders. And the millions of dollars, I don't have money to run a TV ad. And you pretend you are poor, complain rent is so high. You couldn't save that apartment for other people to rent in Nashua. Just go back to your $2 million home in Portsmouth. Please don't say that, because you do not understand regular people's concern. People cry in my arms on District 2.
All right, back to Rich Baris's analysis here.
Voted by now. They don't have the numbers. They just have the machine of politics and the media.
So, and I'm laughing. I'm so glad you brought up the John Ralston tweet. He writes, "Damn, Republicans registered 10,000 more voters. Damn, no edge at all." So,
yeah, Mr. Impartial.
Yeah, I'm like, wow, this guy's really bad. He's really bad. So when you're talking about the swing states, I mean, I don't know how some swing states will go one way and others go the other. I guess maybe it's the ground game, but I mean, how do you look at this then in Michigan? Because the Arab American vote is not going to Kamala. I mean, how do you feel about Michigan, Pennsylvania, that side of it versus the Sun Belt? We have Nevada, you have Arizona, and I guess Georgia, it's south, but.
I don't like to be too bold because I don't want to sow complacency.
Sure.
But let me put it this way: the Harris campaign is not even really bothering with the Sun Belt. Why do you think that is?
Yep.
They're looking at the numbers too. They know. Instead, they have Barack Obama lecturing black men in the Rust Belt that they're basically sexist if they don't go and vote for Kamala Harris.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because the campaigns, you listen to what they do and what they say more than these public polls that I'm telling you are really struggling this year. You have pollsters and big media who don't want to give Trump an edge because, face it, they could be fired for doing it. CNN fired their pollster even though they were more accurate after 2016. They showed a Trumpy race in some of those states. Arizona was one of them, but also in Nevada. And they got fired for it. ABC News fired Gary Langer. He's now sidelined, and they're using the Ipsos panel. Why? Because Gary Langer, during the primary, was showing extraordinarily strong polling results for Trump. So pollsters are really shook. They don't want to underestimate Trump again, but they also don't want to show him in the lead, Garrett. They don't, because it's not their world. It's not their universe. And if Harris were to pull it off and they showed a Trump lead, they're gone. Mark my words,
Wow.
They're gone. So it's very difficult. They're having a bit of a little bit of a professional crisis. I always just try to follow the numbers. And when we polled Michigan, there was no doubt there was a crack in the Arab American bloc for Democrats. Joe Biden won them almost universally. And by the way, they're large enough of a voting bloc that the number of them accounts for Biden's entire margin in Michigan back in 2020. So, I mean, there's no doubt there's a problem there, but also, it really comes down to these polls over the years, not just the last couple of cycles, but going back even to 2000.
All right, thoughtful essay that I stumbled upon at AmericanMind.org. There's one fundamental task Trump can still do for us. Making politics possible again means we must be able to see some connection between our political deliberations and our votes and the laws that govern our lives. The policies that prevail must be understood to have our consent. We need to know that we are governing ourselves and that a legitimately obtained majority of the people is responsible for the direction of the United States of America. Right, today, the people's active participation in politics is being replaced by the dictates of an administrative state. So this is why the Trump campaign would like to replace 50,000 civil servants with 50,000 people dedicated to the Trump agenda. Right now, we're run by the dictates of an administrative state, populated by bureaucrats, no one elected, who think they know America's interests better than we do. Politicians are largely ornamental operatives who do the bidding of the donors while blaming their inability to satisfy voters on the machinations of the bureaucracy and the evergreen excuse of needing a bigger majority. And for decades now, these forces have worked together to choke off our ability to engage in meaningful self-government. America now seems on the cusp of an important victory in this fight for self-government, with a second Trump administration, possibly a Republican-controlled House and Senate. But that victory is only the beginning. If we can't accomplish a restoration of meaningful politics in the next 4 years, America may be lost. Given that danger, inspiring Americans to demand a government where politics is possible again needs to be the first priority of the Trump administration. Tribulations of the last 8 years have had at least one beneficial side effect, right? We don't require much abstract theorizing to understand that our way of life is under assault. In 2016, when Trump sought the presidency, America's ruling class recoiled. Their reaction was visceral. It was not just limited to Democrats. It was something more than just an expression of personal distaste for Trump policies or for Donald Trump, the man himself. It was almost as though the ruling class was more put off by who Trump stood for than by what Trump stood for. The notion that these dirty, unwashed masses ought to have some meaningful say about the direction of their country appeared to shake these elites to their core and fill them with absolute rage and disgust. The ruling class's disgust has always been most apparent when they discuss Donald Trump supporters, the deplorables, as Hillary Clinton called them, or garbage, as Joe Biden described them. To understand this hatred, we must remember in 2016, the ruling class was riding high. Barack Obama and his progressive reimagining of the meaning of America's fundamental transformation, right, was pursued for 8 years of his presidency without damaging too much his personal popularity. The elites in government and in Obama's orbit understood that his leftward tilt was about something more fundamental than mere policy direction. It's about the very purposes and structures of American government. Feeling sure that Obama's enduring appeal meant that his revolution of advocating naked progressive administration might become permanent, the smart set got comfortable discussing the details of their rule openly, as though they had obtained their status by divine right. Whereas other progressive presidents had felt compelled to cloak their progressivism in the language of American constitutionalism, Obama and his Confederates were buoyed by their certainty that Americans would now past caring about the Constitution or quaint 18th century notions like the consent of the governed. Politics no longer involved antiquated ideas like ambition counteracting ambition or competing and counterbalancing interests. Said the members of our ruling class would happily volunteer to serve as enlightened statesmen at the helm of a ship, that they could steer away from ignorance, from popular superstition, from the prejudice of the common people clinging to their guns and religion, and instead direct everything towards scientific progress. And politics no longer required these elites to make themselves acceptable to ordinary Americans. America's national sovereign, the people, would just have to catch up with the elite wisdom. So the elites were in charge. Politics was now just a matter of implementing policies about which the science was centered. Consent, if you could get it, might be useful, but is never thought of as important, and it could always be manufactured after the fact. Once Obama was elected, the ruling class assumed that disagreement and deliberation about broad policy goals should be over, questioning things such as whether mass immigration is good for the country, whether we should use America's power and might to effect a regime change in far-flung parts of the globe, whether we should have absolute free trade. This was now considered out of bounds. The science of politics had settled these things. You had to either accept the science or you were ignorant. The ruling class considered itself indispensable now that the objectives of the progressive administrative states were to be carried out forever. They believed that Obama had cracked the code of government. Right? They'd finally identified a way to harness government without popular consent, without appearing to change anything. So identity politics and these new narratives were all perfected to keep the common people occupied while the partisans of the ruling class were making policy that served their interests. Americans were expected to understand that these questions had now been taken away from the kids' table where they sat, and they could pick up their crayons and content themselves with demented fairy tales about their past, about their racial resentments, their genital fixations, and Hitler memes. Donald Trump changed all that. He arrived on the scene as a serious candidate who pretended to want to reduce the size and scope of government. This rocked the world of the ruling class because this man was bold, brash, and every bit as charismatic as Obama. His idea about America's politics and the idea that there ought to be American politics struck the elites with both terror and disbelief. Trump did not make the fundamental error of campaigning like a traditional Republican or even member of the Tea Party, droning on and on about the need for small government. Right? Instead of talking in an anodyne way about government size, Trump started bluntly asking what government should do, for whom it ought to do it, and who should decide what it does. What powers does this government have, and whose interests ought to be driving its actions? Donald Trump had fundamentally different answers to these questions than the assumptions driving the elites. He was willing to absorb their insults as they demanded that he stop taking and answering questions. Right? We have this now whole society liberalism, right? You notice this most particularly during COVID, where you had an integration of all sorts of institutions, public and private, academic and government, the media, all united, non-governmental organizations, all united in a common political ideological front. So you would have ideas that would travel from progressive academia through the world of NGOs and foundations popping up in the policies of Democratic administrations. You had the language of corporate human resources, right, becoming increasingly dominant. Think of all the various COVID-era entanglements between left-wing activists, social media companies, legislators, public health officials. You had the emergence of the liberal censor. You had anti-disinformation activists making demands of social media giants to sensitively protect their readers from reading anything that might be harmful to them. So we have government that enacts policies and then enlists corporations, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and even individual citizens to enforce their policies, creating a 360-degree police force made up of the companies you do business with, the civic organizations that you think should make up your communal safety net, even your neighbors. So what this looked like in practice was a small group of powerful people using public-private partnerships to silence the Constitution, to censor ideas they don't like, to deny their opponents access to banking, credit, the internet, other public accommodations in a process of continuous surveillance, constantly threatened cancellation, and vast amounts of social control, right? So an approach that originated with the war on terror is now used through surveillance and coordination, originally intended for countering terrorist extremism, and is now operated on a wider range of perceived dangers, many of them populist and right-wing, such as the trucker protests in Canada. Those protesters had their bank accounts frozen by Justin Trudeau. So at the end of the Cold War and beginning with Bill Clinton, we had the stewards of the liberal order who moved in a post-liberal direction, right? They abandoned the essential tenet of liberalism, the state, society, public-private distinction. Instead, they developed a model of politics in which the state acts in concert with an ever-widening array of non-governmental partners, philanthropic, academic, corporate, and financial, who have more freedom of action because they are not bound by traditional liberal limits on state power. So, and in foreign policy and in economic policy, this post-liberal shift among the liberals involved an increasing role for publicly mandated, privately imposed sanctions, where you have banks, corporations, financial institutions putting aside their neutrality and helping the United States isolate its enemies. So we have a post-liberal haze that's fallen over domestic, cultural, and political debates. So by the time the Trump era arrives, it's hard to determine exactly where the actual points of political decision were in hot-button debates. Consider the debate over transgender rights and youth transitioning. Are the key actors the activists demanding a specific line on transgender rights, or the medical associations charged with establishing best practices for transgender care, standards that were influenced by the activists and are tremendously economically rewarding, right? A lot of profit for doctors who get into transgender care because you need to constantly keep coming back to doctors and need more and more care. Was it the social media companies that would police their users for transphobia? And the liberal politicians who supported all these movements with general forms of legislation such as the Equality Act, whose exact intended effects are not always clear. So when you ask who is setting policy here, the answers can be hard to pin down. All right, let's take a brief break from America, look at the conflict between Israel and Iran.
You look at the Republican convention. The party's divided over what to do about Ukraine. The parties are divided about what to do about NATO. They're divided on all these issues around foreign policy. I guess maybe not China. But the one issue that was talked about at the Republican convention where there was no division, none, was Israel. I just think it's important to keep in mind, like, the center of gravity of a political movement matters a lot to whoever the leader is of those movements, even when you're dealing with unpredictable politicians. And so I think Tucker Carlson on these issues as a minority within the conservative movement.
Well, thank God I don't have to vote on Tuesday. I don't have to vote. This is your problem. It's not my problem. I do. But you're right that there is passion in the Republican Party. They love Israel, but they also don't want the whole MAGA, the whole isolation. It's such a powerful instinct in the mythology of MAGA movement. The war in Iraq is one of is what brought America down. And there is a narrative that Israel pushed America to war with Iraq. And these voices are there. And isolationism is strong. And Trump, if like Trump chose for his first vice president an evangelical Christian, the second one an isolationist. We heard J.D. Vance saying America is not going to fight a war in Iran. He said that clearly. All I'm saying is, probability-wise, the chance that we'll get the Pompeo paradigm is higher than we get the Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson isolationist paradigm. But since as an Israeli, our existence is here, I don't like the chances. So maybe I'll try to capture this. What I like about the Republican side is that they understand our story and they identify with our story. Yes, we're in a war with Iran, but I'm afraid they don't want to be a player in that story. They don't want to be a part of the war with Iran. So that's the downside of Trump. That's how this is all connected to our conversation.
Okay, and what about Harris?
Well, the question is, just like Trump is somehow between the isolationists and the Mike Pompeo, which is a geostrategic translation of the pro-Israel evangelical sentiment, just like Trump is between two different ideological movements when it comes to Israel, the isolationists and the evangelical Christians. So Kamala Harris is also between two movements, between liberals and progressives. And progressives, by the way, are not liberal, they're anti-liberal. And liberals like Joe Biden is great for Israel in the sense that he's with Israel in defense, and he supports Israel in defense. He also wants to restrain Israel when it comes to offense. So he's with us on the defense, he's not completely with us on offense. The woke progressives, they're against us in defense. Some of the woke Congress people, they voted against Iron Dome. So this is the hierarchy. Pompeo supports us in defense and in offense. Biden, defense, more careful in the offense. Woke, not offense, and against us in defense. So where is Trump here? Is Trump Pompeo? That's the question, because he's trapped between the isolationists and the evangelicals. That's the question. Where is Kamala? Is she a Biden or is she woke? Is she with us in defense and not in offense, but is she also against us in defense? My assessment is, and I'm just an Israeli, I can't make an assessment of American politicians, that she won't turn against us in defense, but she'll definitely try to restrain us in offense more than Joe Biden. So the way I capture this for Israelis is that with Trump, there's a tremendous upside. You could go Pompeo paradigm and a downside, Tucker Carlson paradigm. The chances for the upside are higher than the downside. With Kamala, there's no upside. I don't think there's a very dangerous downside. I think she'll be like one or two notches beneath Biden. So paradoxically, Kamala is the conservative bet. There's no upside. The chances for downside are lower.
Right. This is from the Call Me Back podcast hosted by Dan.
And October 7th is just the last episode of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A critical mass of Israelis are migrating from living in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to living in the Israeli-Iran war. We're in the first episode of probably a 10-year Israeli-Iran war. Now that shift has a lot of implications.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Instead of talking about Israel versus Palestinian, we're now in the opening of a 10-year war between Israel and Iran.
And I want to start with the success with which Israel has had with Hezbollah and Iran. In Israelis' eyes, how is this success being interpreted? Does it feel like a 1967 moment where Iran is the new Egypt or Syria, and Israel has just struck a major blow against, like it did on the eve of the Six-Day War, during the Six-Day War?
Yeah, there is. Our Six-Day War is our mythological girlfriend. You always compare every war to the Six-Day War, and then you always feel like, oh, this wasn't a good war. So we're always comparing ourselves to that. But I think this is what's really happening. I think what we're witnessing is the failure of Iran's strategy. Iran has a strategy, and it was a sophisticated strategy. It was a brilliant strategy, and it was really serving Iran well. And their strategy was the following strategy. They fought 8 years between 1980 and 1988, the Iran-Iraq War. And the Iran-Iraq War, you think about like World War I. A lot of casualties, a lot of trauma, and no achievements. Nothing happened. They lost hundreds of thousands of people. They don't gain territory, no assets, nothing. It was a meaningless war. Iran came out of the Iran-Iraq War traumatized. And what they learned from the Iran-Iraq War, and they don't want to repeat that trauma, means they want their wars be fought not by Iranians and not in Iran. And later on, they developed the proxy strategy, which serves those goals. Iran, traumatized by the Iran-Iraq War, gets to fight its wars not in Iran and gets the people who fight for them not to be Iranians. And it worked for them. They got Palestinians dying for Iran. They got Lebanese people dying for Iran. And it's perfect because they get to attack Israel without being attacked by Israel. And just notice, Dan, what happened the past 3 months. Everything is upside down.
Right. When you get other people to do the dying for you, that really benefits your side.
Instead of the proxies fighting for Iran, and instead of Iran, now Iran is exposed because of its proxies. But I do think we should create a distinction, Dan, between what we're doing with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. I'll give you now an Israeli perspective. I think when we think about Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, they belong to different categories. In a timeline where there's past, present, and future, we hope that this war with Hamas is our last war with Hamas. We also hope that this war in Lebanon, this is not the third Lebanon war. This is our last Lebanon war. This is what we hope for, and this is the goal. When it comes to Iran, no Israeli is thinking that this what we're doing now with Iran is putting an end to our battle with Iran. I think it's obvious to us that this is the beginning of our battle with Iran. So while with Hezbollah and Iran, this is a war to end the war with them, with Iran, this is a war which is probably the preview. This is the war that's before the bigger war with Iran. I think that's how we're seeing this.
Beyond that, is there any other way that the story is shaped by this?
Every action we do, every activity we participate in lives in a certain narrative, lives in a story. And I think it would be fair to say that the story where the action is located is more important than the action itself. Let me give you just an example. It's a great illustration of how the same action lives in different narratives. All this violent activity that we're involved in. What story does this activity live in? There's 3 possible stories, and they're all true. One story is that October 7th, this is a part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 1929, there was maybe the conflict began, like an historian Egon Cohen argues. 1929, it began in a pogrom in Hebron and different places in Israel. There was 1948, what the Palestinians called the Nakba. There was 67, and then there's the first Intifada in 1987, and the second Intifada in 2000, and now we have October 7th. Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's a bloody story with many episodes, and October 7th is the latest episode of that story. Many people believe in this story. Yes, they do. But here's an alternative story. October 7th and this war that we're fighting is not the latest episode of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it's the first episode of the Israeli-Iran war. And Gaza, Hamas, that's Iran. We're in the first episode of probably a 10-year Israeli-Iran war. There's a third option, the option that Neil Ferguson speaks about. His framework is very different. The world is now entering, or we already entered, Cold War II. Not World War III, Cold War II. Just like in Cold War I, where there's 2 centers of power that triggered proxy wars, in Cold War II, there's proxy wars. And Israel-Iran is a proxy war of the whole reorganizing of Cold War II, centers of power, United States, China. So October 7th, where does it live? In a global narrative? Is it part of Cold War II? A regional narrative? Israel-Iran war? Local narrative? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And the interesting thing is that all these narratives work. They all shed light on what's happening. We're the guy that is eating salad because he's on a diet. He's also vegetarian, and he happens to keep kosher. The same action lives in all narratives. So with that framework, here's, I think, the news I want to share. Most Israelis used to live in a very local narrative. It's us and the Palestinians. That's where we used to live. It's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And October 7th is just the last episode of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think what's happening, and Iran is helping this to happen, is that Israelis are now migrating into a new narrative. You know how when you move, when you change your apartment, it's so complicated, move into a new neighborhood, you have to find a new school, you have to reorient yourself. Well, Israel is moving, and we're changing a narrative. Critical mass of Israelis are migrating from living in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to living in the Israeli-Iran war. Now, that shift has a lot of implications.
So can you rattle some of them off?
So I want to think about 2 things just to begin with. One, think about probabilities. If we're living in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the way out is to solve the conflict. If we're living in the Israeli-Iran war, the way out is for the Iranian people to liberate themselves from their hostile regime. Okay, so in one story, the way out is solving the conflict. 2-state solution, 2 liberal democracies living in security side by side. The Israeli-Iran war, it has a good ending if the regime collapses. Now, where do you think has higher probability? Solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or toppling of the regime in Iran?
Toppling the regime in Iran.
Now, again, I don't think we should ignore the conflict. But what does this mean? It means that most Israelis had 2 understandings of life. 1, we're living in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 2, you can't solve that conflict. Now, that is a very frustrating place to live in. And you have no agency. There's nothing you can do. Now we're migrating into a new story, and now we're Israelis think maybe this could have a good ending. Now we have more agency. So increase in Israeli sense of agency, that is one dramatic impact.
Fascinating analysis there. That's Dr. Micah Goodman. He's a best-selling author in Israel. And some of those tools that he used for understanding the narrative that you're living in can be applied in all sorts of different situations. Let's get a burst here from Fox News.
Both vice presidential candidates will be in North Carolina today. You have J.D. Vance holding a rally in Sanford this afternoon, and then this evening, Tim Walz will be in Gastonia. That's where former President Trump was yesterday. North Carolina's record-setting early voting period has ended with nearly 57% of the state's registered voters already casting ballots. In 2020, Democrats outpaced Republicans by more than 1 million early ballots, but this year, both parties had a strong showing, with Republicans slightly outpacing Democrats. Now the campaigns pivot to Election Day.
The strategy is find those voters who have not voted early, get them to the polls. Find the voters who are your consistent supporters, make sure they show up. And for those few persuadable votes who are out there.
While polls suggest Trump and Harris are in a statistical tie in North Carolina, Democratic insiders tell New York Magazine they are, quote, nauseously optimistic about their chances. But North Carolina Congressman Greg Murphy tells Fox News he believes Mr. Trump is further ahead than the polls suggest.
I think some people are reluctant to admit, good, bad, or indifferent, that they're really pulling for President Trump just because some of the emotional attitudes that go through that.
And one of the biggest surprises, Dana, in early voting was the heavy turnout in the western part of the state, that region heavily damaged in the wake of Hurricane Helene. Turnout there was around 59%, and that's about 2 points higher than the statewide average. Dana?
All right. Thank you so much, Jonathan Sari.
Okay,
Bill?
Dana, want me to confuse you for a second here?
Oh, I love it.
All right.
Well,
Okay.
let's see if you can.
So, right. Yeah, good query there. This is what we showed you last hour. This is the last New York Times polling they put out late last night in the swing states. They've got Trump up in Arizona. They've got Kamala Harris up by a point in Georgia. Dead out tie in Michigan. North Carolina, they've got her up 2. Let me see, Nevada, they've got her up 3. Pennsylvania, flat out tie. In Wisconsin, they've got her up 2. This is where it gets really interesting, okay? Here we go. What if we're all wrong, right? Maybe the blue wall's red. Maybe the Sun Belt's blue. Is that possible? Voters deciding over the last few days, is this what the New York Times has determined? Voters are breaking for Harris, they believe, but in the Sun Belt, 2-1 over Trump. In the North, 60-40 Trump. Is that possible? I guess. Who knows? Maybe they're wrong. And maybe they've nailed it. This happened across the street last night, right around midnight.
Now, Kamala, take my Pamela.
Last night to appear on Saturday Night Live. It's the show's final episode before the election. So who didn't get an invite? Donald Trump on the other side of the 2024 ticket. Mary Catherine Ham is host of the Getting Hammered podcast. Charlie Hurt is opinion editor of the Washington Times, and both are Fox News contributors. Here's a headline that I remember. This is from October 7th. Saturday Night Live head insists there will be no Trump or Harris cameos this season, and he cited equal time provisions. He said, you can't bring the actual people who are running on because of election laws and the election time provisions. You can't have the main candidates without having all the candidates, and there are lots of minor candidates that are only on the ballot in like 3 states, and that becomes really complicated. What happened there, Mary?
It's very interesting, Lauren. What did happen? I don't know. Look, I'm not mad that somebody goes on SNL. You can take it up with the folks in Detroit who I think she was going to go see and then took a detour to NYC to do this. The skit was fine. I thought Maya Rudolph was carrying it. I thought, like, can she be president? So I don't know how much it gets you. She's done a lot of these things where she's trying to sort of soften herself and look like she can interact like a normal person, and I don't know how well it comes off all the time. Trump would do well in the same situation, but I think he's taking his moments in a garbage truck and at McDonald's, and he kind of does his showman thing in those spaces and doesn't really need to be on SNL and goes viral.
Does NBC get punished for this? I don't know. Does the FCC come down on them, or is this a sign that they see something where, hey, man, we had to make a radical change here because she was flying to Michigan. Yeah. The plane was diverted to New York. Are they seeing something where, like, hey, man, we need a Hail Mary pass?
Well, they have pretty good testimony from Lorne Michaels right there. It would seem to be a problem. But could you imagine if them allowing Donald Trump to come in and do the cold open?
Their heads would explode.
Yeah, and it wouldn't happen. But I agree with Mary Catherine that, the problem, this is the problem with doing sort of the Hollywood campaign. I think it actually makes people feel like they're more disconnected from her, whereas you have Trump doing these sort of more organic things and highly entertaining, by the way. That gets he seems to break the internet about 3 times a week, and so he gets that sort of into the culture stream pretty well on his own without the help from Beyonce and Lizzo or Maya Rudolph.
In the last little bit, Kamala Harris is going to try to change back to unity. We started with unity.
So it strikes me that Donald Trump is absolutely at the top of his game. A great quote here in this little riff from comic John Mulaney. One thing that unites LA is wherever you go, there's zero sense of community.
You keep hearing us say LA. What do we mean by LA? Well, in many ways, we mean Los Angeles. Let's take a look at what that means. Yeah, dude, this is it. Well, look at this beautiful organic shape. Not at all cynically designed to go down to the harbor. It's so, what a sprawling and ongoing situation this is. They took time to think of little cute names for every area, and then they got down here and they went, South Los Angeles, Southeast Los Angeles. Fun fact, did you know LA has a mayor? If you were rolling around town, you'd be like, no mayor, right? But, and then you'd be like, for no mayor, it's going okay. Like, And that's not a knock at the current mayor, not at all. I think it is crazy in any decade for any person to look at all this and go, I got it. I'll be able to handle that. A little history. The first person to ever move to Los Angeles was a Spanish explorer in 1781 who thought he'd give it a shot here after friends told him he was the funniest guy at work. The city of Los Angeles was officially founded in 1842 as a place for improv students to go hiking. One of the stereotypes of LA is that it's all these, you know, magical movies being made everywhere. Well, that's not Los Angeles. That is Vancouver up here. Every movie's made in Vancouver or Atlanta. If you saw someone making a movie in the city of Los Angeles, it would probably be in Studio City, which is not a city, it is a neighborhood. In the same way that Koreatown is not a town. It's a neighborhood. In the same way that Silver Lake is not a lake, it's a reservoir. In the same way that Los Feliz translates to the happy ones, but it is in fact filled with very unhappy people. This is Beverly Hills, famous, right? 90210, you've heard of Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills is like fancy-ish. It's expensive in the way that the things DJ Khaled wears are expensive, but they don't fill you with envy. You're like, that's out of my range, but that's fine. That's one thing about Los Angeles. A lot of people think it's like a very fashion-y city. There's lots of fancy people wearing stylish clothes. But in fact, most men in Los Angeles dress like dog shit.
What bothers me, you go to the beach and it's filled with people wearing their T-shirts into the ocean. Come on, guys.
Now, contrary to popular belief, Los Angeles does have a subway system, boasting over 1.5 miles of track. It is ridden by upwards of 15 Angelinos and counting.
I finally rode LA's underground subway, and it was a frightening experience. The amount of dysfunction, homeless, drug-addicted, crazy, yelling, psycho people around. Ugh.
Some civics. In 1919, the LAPD was founded as a place for men to wear Oakley sunglasses on the back of shaved bald heads. The LAPD serves and protects this entire city, but it mainly responds to calls from these two areas.
Brentwood and Pacific Palisades.
In an effort to fight crime, though, and in an effort to prevent criminals from having conversations, the LAPD flies a helicopter over every single person's home for 12 to 13 hours a day. Crime and, yeah. It's like being in a movie. It's fun. True crime and Los Angeles are kind of synonymous. In fact, in the 1970s, a plague of serial killers terrorized LA's freeways and streets. There were the toolbox murderers, the freeway killers, the Night Stalker, and the Hillside Stranglers. They had cool names and cool branding. But that doesn't mean that what they did was right. In fact, it was wrong.
I too am not a fan of murder.
Thank you. Thank you. You're a brave man. You're a brave man. Over here is the beach. Venice, Playa del Rey, Santa Monica. The beach is where you find dentists who pretend to be bikers on the weekend and where you find surfing. Surfing was invented in 1955 by a man named Donald Surfing, who could not swim. He wanted to find a way to stand on the floor, but in the ocean. The fad became so popular, it was immortalized in a song by a little band from Hawthorne called the Beach Boys. And that song was, Daddy's Gonna Take Your Fucking Car Away. Of course, all of us know the heart of Los Angeles is downtown LA. A place we all like and go to often. See you in downtown LA, we say to each other. Fun fact, every hotel in downtown LA has its own Netflix true crime documentary. A lot of people are always wondering, what happened to New York in the 70s? It moved to downtown LA, where it is thriving. Nice streets. One thing that unites every part of Los Angeles is that no matter where you go, there is zero sense of community. And
Okay, that is a good line. Back to
Hugh
from
Hewitt had
Fox.
quite a moment the other day, and I just want to ask you specifically about the coverage, et cetera. Here's Hewitt first.
Is it me, or does it seem like this week Donald Trump is laying the groundwork for contesting the election by complaining that cheating was taking place in Pennsylvania by suing Bucks County for alleged irregularities?
We are news people. We have to report the whole story. So, yes, he's upset about Bucks County, but he was right, and he won in court.
I don't appreciate being lectured about reporting.
I won't come back, Jonathan. I'm done. I'm done. This is the most unfair election ad I've ever been a part of.
He left that interview and then quit the Washington Post. When you think about the comedian at Madison Square Garden, when you think about what Trump the other night saying he'll protect women, he was talking about crime and illegals, they made it seem it was all about abortion. And the New York Times did a big write-up about it and did not quote what Trump actually said. Just what is, in these closing weeks or days, what is your view about how the media's handled this?
I mean, not to be overly harsh about it, but I do feel like there is a deep, profound concern among a lot of people at the New York Times and people like Jonathan Capehart who are terrified. They're starting to realize that, oh my gosh, the orange monster really is on course to come back and be president again. Now, obviously, we have no idea what's going to happen on Tuesday, but I think they're freaking out and they are sort of letting their slip show, and whatever pretense was left of them trying to be fair and balanced about these things is completely gone out the window. They're not, and you know, the idea that Hugh Hewitt is a very cerebral, balanced, normal, intelligent guy. And the idea that Capehart is going to sit there and lecture him like he's some sort of right-wing nut job is just idiotic. And of course, this comes after Jeff Bezos has dropped the hammer on his Washington Post and said, "Hey, listen, guys, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to try to actually start reporting the news accurately." And you know, the frustration has reached a peak with.
I would say after this election is over, there's going to be a deep read that will be required for many of us.
But it's a great question you asked. How many times have we said that? After how many elections have we said that? And I do think that the credibility gets washed away with each one of these elections, which I think is a good thing.
Well, and in a time of plummeting public trust, like this country is desperately in need of reliable narrators. A politician's going to sway things their way on either side, right? But the press's actual job is to tell the truth about these things so that people who are reading the news don't have to go and watch 3 primary sources and parse it out. In this case, Hugh's doing the job of the reporter, of the reliable narrator. He's bringing facts to the table. He's an unflappable guy. He's very mild-mannered, and they ticked him off enough that he walked. But I'm glad the viewers got some facts before.
Mark Halperin in his morning newsletter said something similar about the media coverage of this election. So, I mean, in 2016, you had the reporters had to go out and do all these stories about how they missed it. Right? So we might see that again. We might.
All right. Interesting analysis here of the situation in Iran that, again, you can use for many different parts of life.
In the region and in its proxy conflict with Israel in recent weeks and months.
So I think the major change in it.
So the headline on this episode, Iran can't afford a war. It's out of options and running out of time. Reminds me a little bit of the situation with the United Kingdom. They've got 2 aircraft carriers that they can't afford, right? That are just a mess and incredibly expensive. Right, the United Kingdom on a downward spiral.
In Iran's foreign policy predates this current crisis by a couple of years. The most significant change in Iranian foreign policy, which has affected us to this day, was their decision after Russia's invasion of Ukraine to double down with Russia. And that basically overturned 200 years of Iranian foreign policy, which was in some ways to try and balance the various forces against it, to use the Russians against the West. It's obviously focused in terms of its own revolutionary ideology against the United States, to a lesser extent against Europe. But by doubling down with Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, it basically alienated a major part of its foreign policy plank, which is Europe, because it's always liked to use Europe as a ballast against the United States to try and. So you have this really bizarre situation at the moment, for instance, that in the current crisis that they're finding themselves in, you're getting a lot of nice words from Pezeshkian, the current president, but also, interestingly, Ali Akbar Velayati, who is the Supreme Leader's advisor on foreign affairs, or one of them anyway.
Here's the exact point I wanted to make about the United Kingdom. Britain's 2 aircraft carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, increasingly proving to be costly liabilities. The Royal Navy of Britain cannot afford these aircraft carriers.
And he said that, Iran is very open to good relations with some Western powers. But the real problem is at the moment is whether Western powers are really interested in good relations with Iran because of the wider political framework. So the dynamic has changed. And of course, this decision in 2022 to side with Russia also meant that the JCPOA was basically dead and buried. I think there was a small chance that it would be resuscitated then, but the Iranians decided not to. And of course, it's fed into all sorts of other problems that now Iran, it was very interesting that in the aftermath of the Israeli attack on Iran, an Iranian journalist very angrily said to the foreign minister, they said, where is this dishonorable, he called him, where is this dishonorable Vladimir Putin when we needed him? When he needs drones, we send him drones. When we need his help, where is the S-400 anti-aircraft missile defense? Where are the fancy jets? And of course, unsurprisingly, Putin hasn't sent any of this because he needs them himself. So he doesn't, So there's a sort of a feeling that Iran has doubled down on an alliance that is has costed a lot but delivered very little.
What was Iran's original calculation when it made that decision? I guess what prompted it to completely give up on Europe in exchange for fully aligning with Russia?
Iran had a very hardline government at the time. And the hardline is very much in the driving seat. But, they basically reflected what the supreme leader wanted. And their belief was that Putin would win the war in Ukraine very quickly. He'd be in Kiev. And then Iran's negotiating position would be even stronger. I mean, that's what the Russians said. They said, you stick with us. And your negotiating position afterwards will be because we will deal a death blow to the West. And of course, the Europeans were saying to the Iranians, don't do this. Don't fall for this. It's not going to happen. But the Iranians decided to believe the Russians, and we are where we are. That was the calculation. It was a very, very bad piece of opportunism.
Do you think there's a chance that they might try to backtrack on this decision once again and sort of rebalance the situation and therefore impose it?
I think some of them are thinking about it. And I think that there is a genuine desire on some parts, but of course they have to change certain things. One of the ways of doing that would be to pull away from the Russian alliance, which they're not prepared to do at the moment. The other way to do it is to release all these dual nationals that they have arrested, all these European dual national Iranian. And of course, they just executed one other guy, a German Iranian. So, what they're doing is, my understanding anyway, is that a lot of Europeans are very fed up with this. And unless Iran makes a very, very concrete gesture, nothing will happen. Nothing will happen. And I don't think domestically they're up to it yet. I think they know what needs to be done, but I don't think they have the political will or political capacity, isn't there?
I want to maybe move more towards the present and what happened especially with Israel in the past weeks and months. If we look specifically at that development, to sort of get back to my original question.
Okay, a couple of comments in the chat. Luke, I was surprised to find out how much Iranians hate Russia and China. I mean, if you were living in Iran and you looked at the quality of life in the United States versus Russia versus in China, of course, you'd rather go American, right? The more Iran is embedded with Russia and China, the more difficult it is for them to have harmonious relations with the United States. Look, reading an Australian author, Tim Winton. Do I know him? Yes, very much. He is terrific fun, Tim Winton. And there was a TV series based on one of his novels about life in West Australia. I don't read many novels. I probably read about 25 nonfiction books for every novel, but I probably read about 4 novels a year. All right, this is Professor Ali Ansari on a podcast called Decoding Geopolitics.
How do you think that changed Iranians' position?
Well, if we went into the summer, you went into the summer with the Israelis probably in more of a military quagmire, which I think they still are pretty much lodged into a sort of a long-scale military.
Chat says that approval rating for the United States among Iranians probably higher than any other Middle Eastern country. And one thing we do know is that 80% of Iranians hate the ruling Islamic regime there.
Operation and conflict. But I think the view when we were going into the summer was that in some ways Iran still had a whip hand, so to speak, in the existence of Hezbollah. Over the summer, the Israelis have used their extraordinary powers of intelligence gathering and their ability to penetrate the Iranian and Hezbollah establishment to completely transform their situation. So not only did they assassinate Haniya in Tehran, very bold assassination, they then completely decapitated Hezbollah's leadership, not just Nasrallah, but
so Hamas was so successful because they went Stone Age, right? Because they did not communicate electronically. Israel was much better prepared for Hezbollah and for Iran, who do communicate electronically. And Israel was able to find out what exactly they were saying to each other.
But also a whole range of their middle range management, so to speak. They've now killed, obviously, Sinwar in Gaza. The problem the Iranians have is they're finding that their options for dealing with Israel as they see it are becoming more and more constrained. They always used to work on the argument that we have Hezbollah and Hezbollah is our deterrence against Israel. Hezbollah is now on the back foot. It's not finished, but it's on the back foot. Hamas is clearly on the back foot. The question really for us observing this is to how much political capacity Israel has left and how far it can go before it also has to start really genuinely thinking about political settlement. And I know there are obviously many people in Israel itself who think that, you cannot go on just like this. I mean, you have to have some sort of political solution at the end of it. But from an Iranian perspective, of course, the Iranians are going to try and see if they can sit out the Israelis. But there are two clocks. There's a clock in Tehran and a clock in Israel. And the question is which one is moving faster towards the end game? And the argument really is that, the Iranian position is much weaker. They have a much weaker economy. They don't have the sort of support that they thought they might get. They believed a lot of their own bluster. And if you compare the Israeli attack with the Iranian attack on Israel and the Israeli attack on Iran, they're at a completely different level of sophistication. That's not to say that the Iranian one was not more showy in some ways, and all these sort of missiles raining down. But the fact is, in terms of technology, the Israelis are leaps ahead, really, of the Iranians, and that they were able to get into Iranian airspace and to cause the damage they did, using long-range air. Remember, these F-35s have a range, I think, of 1,300 kilometers. So they would have needed, obviously, air refueling to get in. And if you look at the background of what they're saying the Israelis did, what they basically did is they tested Iran's air defense system and they found it was weak. That's basically what it is. They didn't do much else, I have to say. I mean, they hit a few, missile bases and sort of missile production, which I think we will see the consequences in the next few months. But actually, this attack was much more of a signal, in a sense, to the Iranians than a show. They weren't going out to kill a lot of people or whatever, which thank God they weren't. But what they were trying to show to the Iranians is you're vulnerable. We can get you. And I think it's caused the Iranians to think a bit. If you look at Khamenei's response recently, he said we mustn't exaggerate the attack, but we mustn't diminish it either. I mean, it's very...
So the Ayatollah Khamenei's response, Kamala Harris's response, all right, they seem to have a great deal in common. They're all over the place. Iran is running through all sorts of reactions and different messages, just like the Kamala Harris campaign is constantly changing its messages, both using a lot of word salad.
Waffly answer, but it was interesting because it wasn't a jingoistic answer. It was basically, we need to think about this very carefully. And I think they realized that the situation is not as good as they thought it was for them.
I think that he also said that there needs to be a response, but it's not going to be him who's going to decide on what the response will be. So sort of pushing away the responsibility.
Yeah. And also, I mean, what they've said is we reserve the right for a response, but whatever. I mean, whatever, that's fine. But I think the problem they have is this, that they have spent all their time saying that the Israeli attack was completely inconsequential. Yeah. So they've said, I don't know. So it's very difficult for them to justify launching another set of missiles because they must know that if they launch another set of missiles against Israel, the next time, the American election will be over, by the way, the next time the Israelis, probably with American backing, will go full in. But, everyone's very cagey about it, very, very naturally so, because, someone said to me, what if Israel had attacked the infrastructure, the economy, the oil, something. And I said, I don't think the Israelis were ever interested in doing this because the Israelis have a notion that they want to go for the regime. They don't want to go for the people. They don't want to make life harder for the people. They want, or they certainly don't want to be blamed for it. Remember that. On the other hand, I said, if the Israelis had gone for Iran's oil facilities, it would have been very easy for them to go for that. But the chances are the Iranians would have then attacked, the oil facilities of the UAE and the Saudis and others as sort of retaliation, which, by the way, itself shows you how limited their options are. They can't attack Israel again, so they're going to attack someone else. What they're basically saying is we'll go down, but we'll take everyone with us. And of course, I don't think the US or anyone really heading into a US election is really ready for that at the moment.
Well, you've mentioned there's a clock in Israel and clock in Tehran. I understand what the clock in Israel looks like, where you basically have to, or the leadership has to consider the public opinion because it will face elections eventually. But in Iran, that's probably not really that much of a consideration. And you've mentioned the economy, but Iranian economy has been doing pretty badly for quite a few years. So what's the clock there?
I think the clock in Iran is the economy. And it has been doing very badly for a number of years. But if you look at the signals coming out of Iran, so for instance, this year was, I think, one of the first years where they were unable to supply electricity to all the cities, continuously over summer. I mean, it wasn't just short power cuts. These were major, serious power cuts. They are finding it difficult to supply water. Now, if you look at the assessments by Iranian economists and stuff, they say the government, by the way, not the regime itself has probably got quite a bit of money, but the government in terms of paying salaries, pensions, this, that, and the other, is running out of money. And Pezeshkian made a wonderful comment where he said, our economy, in order to stay afloat, requires $200 billion worth of investment. We have $100 billion, but we need another $100 billion from everyone else. And I mean, where is that going to come from? I mean, and I have to tell you, this is a very conservative estimate of what the Iranian economy wants. So it's true that the Iranian economy is doing very badly for a long time and it can sustain it. But as any social scientist historian knows, there is always a crunch time. There is always a crunch time. I mean, eventually the critical mass will form. The question for you and I and others, of course, is to try and assess when this critical mass will be, and will the Iranians have it? The problem is, I think, that if you look at the attitude of the Iranians within Iran to the regime, they are so unhappy with the regime that the general view is it would not take much for another round of protests to emerge. It would not take much. And most people are expecting it, to be honest, that it will come. And I think the catalyst will be economic. But let's say, for the sake of argument, the Israelis do launch a wider attack on Iranian infrastructure, then that will hasten the problem. But of course, the fallout of that is much more dramatic. And people, again.
Right. Interesting interview there with Ali Ansari, a professor who specializes in the Middle East. All right. What should we look for on election night? I believe that we will know who the next president will be by 6:30 p.m. West Coast time, 9:30 p.m. on the East Coast on election night. I believe we're going to find out pretty quickly. This is Henry Olson.
This rant is for you. So, election night, 7 p.m. is the first swing state time to look at. Georgia's polls close at 7 p.m. Now, you might say, well, so the polls close, but we won't know what happens forever. Au contraire, Pierre. Georgia law has been changed since 2020. Georgia now requires every county, every voting jurisdiction to post 100% of its early votes by 8 p.m. Eastern. Now, Georgia has a massive early vote program. As of today, when we're speaking, over nearly 3.3 million people have voted. That is expected to be a little over 60% of the expected turnout. We've got 3 or 4 more days of early voting. We expect early votes to be between 70 and 80% of all votes cast in the Peach State as of Tuesday, and they'll all be released by 8 o'clock. So what that means is we'll have a really good handle on this first state. And what are you going to be looking at?
Right, and he's talking East Coast time. By 5 p.m. West Coast time, we should have a good handle on this election.
Well, the first thing to look at, obviously, is who's ahead. Historically, the early vote in Georgia has been Democratic. That in 2020, that early vote is what propelled Biden to victory. In 2022, Raphael Warnock had a lead in the early vote, and Herschel Walker chipped away at it, but was never able to overcome it. We'll find out whether or not that's the case. One of the things that Georgia early voting has so far shown is that the higher rates of early voting are in the Republican areas, not in the Democratic areas. It's particularly not high in African American areas. It may very well be that Trump is ahead or really only small bit behind in the early vote. If that's the case, then Harris can win only if the election day vote is much more Democratic than it has been in the last 2 elections in Georgia. Again, it may be that that is the case. Some of the early vote is clearly being people who voted on election day in 2020 voting early in 2024. The rate of that is about twice as much in Republican areas as it is in Democratic areas, which say somewhere between 8 and 10% of the total early vote in Republican areas is from people who voted on election day in 2020, where only about 5% of that is Democratic. That's not a huge difference because you're talking about maybe 275,000 votes statewide, but it's not nothing. It may mean that the election day vote is tilted somewhat to Harris. But again, what you should expect is that unless Democrats pour out of their homes in the next 4 days, the early vote will be more Republican than it has been in the past. And how Republican will give us a pretty clear sign whether it's going to be a close race or whether we'll be able to call it one way or another. The next swing state to watch for is North Carolina. North Carolina closes its polls at 7:30. It, too, has a very extensive early voting program. It does not have a state law that requires early votes to be posted by a certain time, but historically they are posted very quickly. And I would expect that they will be posted across the state by 9 p.m. Maybe not immediately the way in Georgia, but pretty early in the night. You've got the same thing, is that historically Democrats do better in the early vote. Sherry Beasley in 2022, I believe, was leading the early vote against Ted Budd in the Senate race. He was able to win by a little over 3 points because the election day vote turned out. So far, they have partisan registration in Georgia. Unlike in past years, there are more people who are registered Republicans have voted as of to this day, Wednesday, October 30th, than Democrats. It's not a huge margin, and certainly about a third of the vote is registered as other, and that might tilt in a different way. But again, it's the same thing as in Georgia. If Democrats are behind in the early vote in North Carolina, they will have to hope for a better election day result than is typical there. If they are ahead by only a small amount, it's the same thing. If the history leads, what we should expect to see, or if it's going to be a good night for Democrats, is a Democratic lead in the single digits, probably not 10 points or so, but a Democratic lead, not in registration, but in terms of Harris being ahead. We'll have a very large number of votes in, but it may not reach the 80% number that it could reach in Georgia, but somewhere in the 60 to 70% rate. The other thing that we need to remind about Georgia and North Carolina is mail voting will be almost negligible. Mail voting is down massively in both states in favor of in-person voting. So we're not going to have this, let's look at 300,000, 500,000, 800,000 mail votes. No, these people are coming and voting in person with voter identification, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we should have a pretty good sense somewhere between the 9 and 10 o'clock range of North Carolina. Depending on what we see, we may have a good sense by 9 o'clock. And then we start to hit the big time. If 7 p.m. was the warm-up act and 7:30 p.m. is the next warm-up act, 8 p.m. is when the main act comes on stage. Pennsylvania closes, and the eastern time zone of Michigan, which is to say almost all the state, but there are fewer counties on the Upper Peninsula that are in the central time zone, their polls will stay open for another hour. Now, both states can release their early vote when the polls close. So Michigan's eastern time zone counties can release early votes. The state laws are different. In Michigan, you can check for suitability. You can check for appropriateness, whether or not a person is a registered voter before Election Day, which means that's called canvassing. You can canvass the votes before Election Day. So Michigan can have theoretically all of its early votes canvassed and then counted and ready to go quickly. We'll know before election night if that's the case, but we could get a lot of quick results from Michigan. Now, we don't know how many people will vote early there. Again, as of today, the turnout is about 30% of registered voters, which probably means 40 to 45% of the total vote cast. They do have in-person early voting. About 100 to 150,000 people seem to be voting a day, and there's still a few 100,000 mail ballots that have not yet been returned. I would expect 50% or so of the total vote to come early, maybe as high as 60. We'll see how many of those votes are returned, what election day turnout is. It won't be as decisive as in Georgia or in North Carolina, but it will be an important indicator. Again, we should expect Democrats to lead in this early vote. And again, the early voting is so far showing not as high turnouts in black areas and low turnouts in the Arab cities of Dearborn, Hamtramck, and Dearborn Heights. Pennsylvania, however, does not allow pre-election day canvassing. You cannot start to check a mail ballot.
So two key things about the early vote, that considerable evidence that the black vote overall is down, which is not a good sign for Kamala Harris, and also that the Arab Muslim vote turnout is quite low, which is bad for Kamala Harris.
To see whether or not its signatures match and it meets the other requirements of a valid vote until 7 a.m. on Election Day. This means that it will take longer for Pennsylvania to report its mail ballots. Now, I've received information from Michael Pusser of Decision Desk HQ that Pennsylvania law says that at 4 p.m.
I'll just leave it there. So we should know a lot by 5 p.m. on the West Coast, 8 p.m. on the East Coast. We may very well know the winner by 6 p.m. on the West Coast. Here's a killer quote from a 2022 book called Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media. After World War II, the imperative of banning Nazi propaganda was cynically exploited by another totalitarian regime. Stalin's Soviet Union used the Weimar fallacy to successfully lobby for the introduction of hate speech restrictions in international human rights law. This not only helped legitimize the crackdown on dissent in the Soviet bloc, it also provided legal cover under international human rights law to Muslim-majority states eager to adopt a global blasphemy ban once communism had been defeated. So that there is the origin of hate speech in international law. Soviet Union taking advantage of a desire to ban Nazi propaganda. There's a thoughtful podcast called Reflector, and they devoted their latest episode to the comeback of Donald Trump.
In the Senate. They were Arizona, but he put up Kari Lake, and she was a disaster. They were Pennsylvania, and Mehmet Oz, who is a Trump-endorsed candidate, lost to
Talking about the 2022 midterm elections where the Republicans did not enjoy the red wave that many thought they would.
Fetterman, a guy who had a stroke, and then most extreme of all, Herschel Walker. What a disastrous candidate. So many better choices for the Republicans, but it was all the Donald Trump candidates that correlated to lost opportunities. And Republicans were saying, why do we keep sticking with this guy? He keeps costing us. Were it not for Trumpism, we'd control the House, which they do. We'd control the Senate, and we'd probably control the White House, given that people don't like Biden. So that seemed to be the moment where Republicans were saying to themselves, we're done with this, only it wasn't.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the event was notably low energy. I'll just actually echo what Mike said. It felt like it was slow. It felt underwhelming to a lot of people who watched it. And I think it's especially interesting because we don't think always of what happened between 2022 and now as a quote unquote comeback, because Trump was actually able to show pretty clearly that the primary wouldn't be competitive as the year dragged on and as we got closer to voters actually going to polling places. But he was seriously weakened at the time. And in his presidential campaign announcement, he said, quote, America's comeback starts now. And I just want to camp out on that question of the tense. America's comeback starts now. Make America great again. He's trying to say that America's on its back foot, and it's Trump stuff.
Okay, got a link from the chat here, a report on Syrian Girl. So
He became a communist. He introduced Haz al-Din. And I ended up in the Discord, and I'd look them over because they were interesting. Let's face it, they were interesting. So the MAGA communists are, the main two are Haz al-Din and Jackson Hinkle are the main two guys who are MAGA communism. There's also, I forgot her name. She was some Arab slut. Not Syrian Girl. Fun fact about Syrian Girl, she got busted for getting double teamed by two dudes in a bathroom at Chuck E. Cheese or whatever.
What?
What? You didn't hear about that?
No.
Oh, God. Okay. So, Syrian Girl.
Do tell. Do tell.
Yeah. Here's Eric Stryker simping so hard for Syrian Girl. And she's actually got arrested because she went up with two guys and got fucking DP'd in a fucking bathroom of some pizza restaurant. Is it a Pizza Hut or a Chuck E. Cheese? I don't know. She was double teamed by two guys in the bathroom. There's Eric Stryker grabbing his dick with fucking Warren here. But you know what? To be fair to Warren, I'll give him this. He only has eyes for Emily Eucas. Good on him. That's the mother of his children. Allegedly.
Emily used by us. Or whatever her name is.
I get shit on him too hard, but goddamn. Stryker pulling his fucking 3.5 inch.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Return to a more erudite discussion here on the comeback of Donald Trump.
Stuck on this American carnage message. And I think where a lot of people in the Beltway, myself included, watched that announcement in November of 2022, not sure of where his legal travails would go in the next year plus, and said, man, really Republicans, this is the guy. But a lot of voters, this is exactly what happened on January 7th, 2021. For as much as the Beltway wants to move on from Donald Trump for ideological reasons and for practical, pragmatic reasons, the voters don't.
Well, let me be sure that I get that. Because, Emily, it sounds like what you're saying is that when we look at this re-election announcement in Mar-a-Lago, and we see that there are no big celebrity endorsements, that many former members of Trump's administration are noticeably absent, that even allies like Ron DeSantis, who are right there in the state, declined to attend, that for many of us who watch politics closely, this was just a revelation of how far Trump had fallen, and maybe even evidence of the consequences of how far he took his claims after he had lost the last election. But while there is truth to that, you're saying that he retained enough enthusiastic support from his base, the 30% or so of the Republican Party that are really big fans of him, and that because our country is so divided and because our elections often are so close, that he, even in this moment, had a pretty decent chance of ending up right where he is today.
I think that's absolutely true. And it gets to the reason you explained that we're here having this conversation about potentially the media continuing to miss the story. This is what I felt. I mean, I was covering on the ground as a reporter January 6th. And I remember talking to members, I remember talking to people in the Republican Party and just sensing this almost relief that they could finally move on from Donald Trump, that he had disgraced himself in such a way that voters would be ready to move on and we could sort of close this chapter and open up a new one. But it was apparent by January 7th and January 8th, it wasn't going to happen. And we saw that play out with the impeachment as well, because there's this hardened contingency. I would put it at about 30% of the Republican electorate, people who vote in Republican primaries, that will not vote for anybody when Donald Trump, anybody else, when Donald Trump is on the ballot. They are the hardcore MAGA faithful, and January 6th did not change their mind. A low-energy November 2022 announcement wouldn't change their mind. They are perpetually excited about Donald Trump. It is not, this is a mistake a lot of people on the right make, it is not the entire Republican Party. It is not the Republican electorate at large, but it's enough that no other candidate can win in a primary, basically. And again, I think that was lost in the story of that kind of sleepy, low-energy night in November of 2022.
Right. No, that makes total sense. And obviously it points to the major role that our current two-party dominated political system plays in the story of how Donald Trump has had this comeback.
So a major difference between the elites and regular people is on the issue of immigration, right? Regular Americans far more concerned about exorbitant rates of immigration to the country.
The owners of the troubled apartment complexes in Aurora that claimed their buildings had been taken over by Venezuelan gangs are now facing an investigation themselves. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I'm Mark Salinger. Documents obtained by 9 News Investigate show the Colorado Attorney General's office has issued subpoenas to CBZ management over recent months. They're investigating potential violations of the state's safe housing laws that regulate housing conditions. The subpoena demands that the management company turn over documents related to how it screens tenants, its finances, how it handles maintenance requests, and how it promotes its apartments to potential residents. The management company owns several apartment buildings in Aurora, claims that the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua had taken them over and were extorting residents, went viral online with this video. They were amplified by former President Trump, who even came to Aurora last month for a speech on immigration. Documents obtained by 9 News show there have been questions about habitability and cleanliness at the apartment complexes for years. More documents show that CBZ started telling the city that it believed its buildings had been taken over by that gang over the summer. Aurora police have arrested a small number of known Venezuelan gang members in the area.
So there was just horrific beating of someone from the management company, right? The manager, they beat him, they tried to extort him, they threatened him when he went onto the property. The management company detailed that for months they went to the state for help with this crime problem and they were ignored. Now the management company are the ones who are getting investigated.
And has found himself in the place where he is today. But I'd also love to go deeper and look at the issues that Americans say are front and center as they go to the polls this year. And I want to start off with the one that affects every single American, and that is inflation. Mike, do you want to start us off?
So inflation's the biggest issue because I think it affects people the most in a way that they don't have to. They feel tease out root causes or various causes. They know what eggs cost then and they know what eggs cost now. And they knew who was president when the price of eggs went up. And it's not just the price of eggs. It's the price of so many other things. And I think it's really important because what we're doing here is saying, but Donald Trump is this abnormal figure, this particular singular figure. But pretend or imagine it's not Donald Trump. It's just person who's not incumbent while inflation was raging. And all throughout the world, all of the incumbent parties, presidents, prime ministers, and leaders are getting crushed.
British Prime Minister Liz Truss faced the wrath of Parliament today.
Yeah, her economic agenda is under added scrutiny as inflation in the UK hits a staggering 10.1%.
I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
Inflation and the handling of the pandemic are fueling anger among Argentines as they head to the polls for midterm elections. President Alberto Fernandez and his Peronist party are in danger of losing control.
The French President Emmanuel Macron has dissolved his country's lower house of parliament and called a snap election after his party suffered a crushing defeat in the European Parliament vote.
Voters in democracies hate inflation more than people ever knew. I sound like Donald Trump a little bit, more than anyone's ever talking about. But we haven't had inflation for 3 decades. There were whole generations of people that never experienced the kind of inflation that the West.
So I pay about 60% more for my groceries compared to when Donald Trump was president. So when I now go shop for groceries for 2 weeks, it typically costs me about $500. It used to cost me at most $300, talking same amount of groceries. Right, Trafalgar, interesting polling group because they don't reveal their methods, but they have a strong history of accuracy.
Say your last name for me because I'm such an old guy. Healy, right?
Healy, yes, sir.
All right, I finally got it. It's an Irish name. I should be able to get it. Healy, you know. Anyway, I want to run down the states. You tell me where they are and what you think is going to happen. Fair enough?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Start with North Carolina. You have Trump up by 3, 49, Harris 46.
Yeah, that's not our final poll in North Carolina, but I do feel very confident. There are a lot of people who think that North Carolina was in play, but the fact is, even in 2022, North Carolina elected a Republican senator and expanded their majorities in both House and Senate, and that was with the new maps and everything. So all right. I think North Carolina's going to be solid.
I have a question about North Carolina because the GOP guy running for governor is getting waxed. He's going to lose by double digits. And is that going to hurt Trump in the Tar Heel state?
Well, we had the same thing in 2016. The Republican candidate for governor lost and Trump won. And then in 2020, the Republican for governor lost and Trump won. And we won a U.S. Senate seat in that state. So North Carolina are just really good ticket splitters. And they can look between a candidate for governor they don't like and the Republican Party they do like.
Obviously, top of the ticket is president, so it's easier to do that. You said we. Who's we? Are you working for the Republicans?
No, I just say in the sense that, like, when I grew up in South Carolina, so they're neighbors, and we always kind of talk. I have a place in North Carolina as well, so I'm kind of a part-time North Carolina.
I just want to clarify. You know me.
Absolutely.
I mean, I want everything on the table here.
Well, and we believe in. My company believes in being independent. I mean, certainly I am a Republican. Make no bones about that. But I care more about being right than I care about party agendas.
Good for you. Let's go south to Georgia. You've got Trump 48, Harris 46. But remember, the Atlanta area, Fulton County and Savannah, those two places dominate in their big Harris territory.
Absolutely. But what we have seen in early voting is DeKalb, Fulton, Gwinnett, and Cobb are down. And the other counties that are more Republican are up. And that is significant. Because in Georgia they don't register by party, so the fact that people are turning out in the more rural areas and the turnout in the more urban areas is down, and they have to get to 29 and 30% black participation in early vote. And right now they're like at 27. It is significantly down, and that is a problem.
All right. Now, I have said Georgia's going to go for Trump because of Laken Riley, the University of Georgia student who was allegedly murdered by a Venezuelan criminal. I think that tilted the race toward Trump. I don't think there's any data to back that up. It's a gut feeling that I have.
But I totally agree with you.
I mean,
Because
I think illegal
where she's
immigration, right, has a more intense bearing on the vote in Georgia. I also believe that you're right about North Carolina. I think it will go to Trump, but it's going to be very close there, in my opinion. Let's go out to Arizona. You have Trump 48, Harris 46, and that's a tie within a margin of error. Maricopa County, Phoenix, dominates, and there's all kinds of problems with voting in Maricopa County. So I don't know about Arizona.
Well, one of the things we did in 2016, and we kind of pride ourselves at doing, is recognize what's called the hidden vote. And the vote for Trump, it's hard. They're hard to get to tell you they're for Trump. And part of that is, in 2016, it was a shame thing that, they didn't want to be judged. But in 2024, we get questions like, who are you? Why are you doing this? What are you doing this information? They're worried about the government getting a list of who's for Trump. They're worried about big tech getting them. They don't want to be canceled. They don't want to have lawfare. And so you have to dig deeper to get that. And we have ways of digging in there. One of the ones that we kind of made public after 2016 was we asking, how do you think your neighbors are going to vote? It's still a vehicle we use. It's a projection device that helps you get past what's called the social desirability bias.
I got it.
Which is when people cater their answers. And what we see in Arizona is a significant hidden vote that is over 8. And usually when you have that kind of a disparity, a third to half of that could end up being added to Trump's total. So I feel comfortable that Arizona is going to go their way, even if there are some typical Arizona shenanigans.
So even though that Trafalgar has it a dead heat with the margin of error, you believe that Arizona will go to Trump?
So I didn't have much confidence in 2016. I thought Trump was going to win, but I was very pleasantly surprised when he did. In 2020, all right, I recognize all the evidence was against a Trump victory. I still thought he was going to pull it out. He almost did, but not quite. This time around, for the first time in these 3 elections, I feel confident of a Trump victory.
Right, because it's been a solid, and that's again not our final poll in Arizona, but it's been a pretty solid lead for a while.
Now you're going to put out your final poll when, so I can use it on Monday?
Yes, well, I'll be out, so we use on Monday.
All right, when are you going to put it out? So I'm make sure I don't want to be taking a nap while you put it out.
We'll put it out we'll put them all of them out over the weekend.
Okay, Pennsylvania.
Sunday night, I'll be there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I believe whoever wins Pennsylvania will be president. You got Trump 46, Harris 43, but you got the same problem in Pennsylvania that you have in Arizona with Philadelphia. Very shaky.
Yes,
Krasner, the district attorney, I believe is corrupt. Okay, I don't think you have any regulation in Philadelphia at all as far as voting is concerned. It dominates the state. So I wouldn't be surprised to see all kinds of stuff emerge there.
Yes, I've been even back into 2016. I've been talking about Philadelphia and their unreliable elections. I've studied this a lot. I have people who are very involved in this, going back to the Black Panther intimidation at the polls in the Bush elections. So what I'll tell you is I generally believe that you have to win Pennsylvania by 2.5 to actually win Pennsylvania. And I feel like Trump has gotten to the threshold that he's winning Pennsylvania by enough to survive any shenanigans, any changes in the rules. I think, and I'm confident that Pennsylvania is one that will go in his column. And moreover, that's the place that we also see a significant amount of hidden vote, people nervous about saying they're for Trump. So I think that added together, even with whatever the Democrats do.
And I think the African-American vote is going to be down from what it was last time around. Again, economics punishing African-American communities. They may not like Trump, but they're going to vote for 4 more years of that. All right, Michigan, another situation very similar. Detroit, biggest city, unreliable. You got Trump 46, Harris 44 in Michigan. What about?
So there's someone commented in the chat, what Squirrel? Who's Squirrel? Well, this is a story that's just taken over Trump Twitter. So apparently New York officials raided this guy's home. They took his squirrel, Peanut the squirrel, and Fred the raccoon that he'd rescued, and they stole Squirrel and killed it.
We learned that they have euthanized Peanut.
And the raccoon as well.
And the raccoon as well. I am so sorry. This must be.
Remember Peanut. Okay. And this is just a meme that's taking over right-wing Twitter right now. Peanut deserved better. Squirrel lives matter. Rest in peace, Squirrel. Some ridiculous judge did sign a warrant for the squirrel. Right, they rescued a squirrel and a raccoon. There was a government raid over the immigration status of the woman, and they took Peanut and they put him to death. Jeremy Kaufman, Peanut the squirrel contributed substantially more to society than George Floyd. I agree with that.
That state.
Michigan is a unique state in the fact that it has such a significant Arab and Muslim population. And it has a lot to do with how they're going to go. I think from what we've seen, we have a lot of them that have told us that they are looking at voting third party or not voting at all. And to take those away from Kamala Harris's block, again, I agree with you. Michigan will have some shenanigans, but there's going to be a lot of people paying attention. A lot more people watching what's happening in Detroit. Absolutely. So I think Michigan's on the bubble. But if it's a good night for Trump, Michigan goes in the win column. But
I think Harris is going to win Michigan. But I could be wrong on that. That state is so divided. But the Democrats have a very strong ground game, as you know, with Whitmer as governor. Very strong. Okay, Nevada, I also think Harris is going to win Nevada. You have Harris up over Trump, for the only one, by a point. Why? What's happening in Nevada?
What I have seen, I'm one of those, just like you admitted, I'm one of those guys that I've gotten Nevada wrong 3 elections in a row. And I'm not calling Nevada because for the Republicans, because I really know what happened that last weekend, this weekend coming up, what they will do with the unions on the Saturday with busing people. They have a list of every union member, and they will collect their ballots, and they will do something that is amazing. It can move this race 2 or 3 points. And even though I think Trump is doing well there, they can move it.
It's not even that hard to do, Robert, because it's only Clark County. That's it.
That's right.
Vegas.
And all the votes are in a very small area. They know all of their names, and frankly, they give them paychecks. They can control a lot of what's happening with this. So, whereas a lot of people think he's going to win Nevada, I don't.
I got Harris winning there, and I don't want to offend anybody in Tonopah, but it's Vegas that matters. Who knows the capital of Nevada out there? Raise your hand. Carson City. Nobody knows that but me. I mean, a geography. Wisconsin. Now, this one is another. You got 2 bastions of liberalism, Madison and Milwaukee, and the rest of the state's pretty conservative. But Trump made a big splash on the garbage thing with Brett Favre and all of that. So you got Trump up by 2%. 0.02. That's crazy.
Well, and let me tell you what I think about that state. And this is also some experience. This is a fact your viewers might not know. Of everyone who registered to vote in 2022, 2023, and 2024, 50% plus registered and voted in November of 2022. They have same-day voter registration and voting. And so what happens is they'll go grab people off the street, college campuses, take them to the polls, register to vote, and vote. And that can move that state. And so it's one of the reasons that if he has just a hair lead there, I don't think he's going to win this one. Unless he's
well, Republicans are doing this same thing there. No, Republicans are got a decent ground game.
They're doing much better.
Right, in Wisconsin. So they'll do exactly what the Democrats are going to do. I mean, I feel sorry for the old people in the little homes when they got one guy, Republican, pounding on the door, the other guy did, oh, no, you got to do this, you got to do that.
Republicans are bound, though, to try to be honest about who they register to vote.
I know, but I don't want to generalize about corruption because we know that it across the board, but
absolutely we do.
It's more sophisticated in the Democratic precincts. So Wisconsin, I think Trump's going to win. Because Trump has spent a lot of time there, and the machine isn't like it is in Philadelphia or Detroit. It's not as, I don't know. I think Trump has got a good chance there. All right, Robert.
We haven't done our final one there, and so right now we have.
And I might even lead with it on Monday what the Trafalgar people say. So
yes,
Atlas predicts that Trump will win nationwide. Trafalgar predicts that Trump will win nationwide. You know, I know that pending the last vote. O'Reilly does, but we all could be wrong. I mean, that's just the reality of life.
Okay, back to this podcast explaining the comeback of Donald Trump. The podcast is called Reflector.
Western world, the world experienced. And when you look at the popularity of Macron or the Prime Minister of Japan or Rishi Sunak, and these are people who are left, these are people who are right, but every one of the parties who was in power during an inflationary period got crushed.
Okay, so Emily, what do you make of that? This is a case I've heard repeatedly, and I think it's persuasive that around the world, despite if you're a lefty, a righty, a socialist, a conservative, if you're in power and inflation goes up, you're in trouble.
That's definitely true. I think one part of this that gets lost on especially Democrats who are trying to wrap their heads around Trump's enduring success with voters, especially on a sort of populist level, is that while inflation did start to come down dramatically around 2022, it starts to decline, it is still not at a level that's pre-COVID. So we started hearing this narrative about Trump nostalgia. So we started actually hearing it explicitly from some Democrats that people were forgetting exactly how bad things were under Donald Trump.
Well, one thing you can be sure, there's going to be a massive amount of chaos if Donald Trump is elected president, because Donald Trump is a classic case of somebody with ADHD. And he's often being accused of narcissism, but there's much stronger evidence for Donald Trump as a
Hello, I'm Dr.
poster boy for ADHD.
Special circumstances for why that's allowing us, me and us, to say that Donald Trump has ADHD. So I am not advocating blithely making armchair diagnoses of public figures. I don't think we should be doing that. So two special circumstances, and I'll be going into those in more detail. One is that Donald Trump has much more videographic evidence of his behaviors. We have a vast trove of information of him in the public domain. And two, the other piece is that the definition of ADHD is based on objective behaviors. We don't need to know the internal feelings, thoughts, or what's going on in a person's mind. But I'll back up a little bit. Why do we make diagnoses, not just in medicine in general, but in psychiatry in particular? Same reasons. One is to understand what is going on. If you have an inaccurate diagnosis, you're not going to really understand what's going on. If you think Mr. Trump is just a narcissist or a sociopath, his behavior doesn't make sense because he does so much that's inconsistent with trying to look big and strong and perfect all the time. So one is to understand. Two, we make diagnoses to predict what would happen if this condition goes untreated. And three, we make diagnoses so that we can find treatments that are specific, appropriate, and helpful for the condition. Now, psychiatry has had a chip on its shoulder for decades because its methods of diagnosis seem less objective than for many other branches of medicine. For decades, we've searched for the blood test for depression, the brain scan for schizophrenia, the EEG pattern for ADHD. And so far, even though we have a huge body of evidence that depression, schizophrenia, ADHD do have a biological basis in the brain, we do not have a single objective biological test that can ascertain completely, assuredly, that someone has one of these conditions. So one of the responses to this dilemma is that psychiatry in its DSM, which is the diagnostic and statistical manual we use for diagnosing things, has moved to be getting more and more objective and descriptive in its criteria for diagnosing conditions, rather than the older versions were based on Freudian analytic beliefs and other probably inaccurate beliefs about the origins of some of these problems. And ADHD, to my knowledge, is the only common mental health disorder right now that we define completely in terms of objective behavior. So with depression, you have to know someone's internal state, that they're sad, that they're some of the other conditions, we need to know the motivation someone has. That's not inherent in the ADHD criteria. So why am I talking about Donald Trump's ADHD now? So my reasons for talking about this are that we have, by all epidemiologic studies, we know there are millions of adults in America with ADHD right now that's affecting their lives, it's affecting other people's lives, and they don't know about it. They're not in treatment, they've never been evaluated. And what I see is that this is a valuable teaching moment. We can use Donald Trump to educate America about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Are there downsides to this approach? Are there potential for stigma and because he is toxic to some people? Yes, and I address that and other questions and aspects in future talk. Poster boy for adult ADHD. But he is the poster boy for blatant, severe adult ADHD that's right in front of our face day after day after day. And yet nobody's speaking directly about it. They're talking about his blurting out sentences without thinking about them. They're talking about how inconsistent he is. They're talking about how inattentive and distracted. They're talking about how his regime has been chaotic. They're talking about how he doesn't.
Right. Once you understand that Donald Trump has ADHD, he just becomes so much easier to understand and to predict.
Do his homework or study for things. They're talking about his restlessness, and nobody's putting the label on it and saying this is ADHD. We should be doing that because, again, if you don't diagnose it correctly, you're not going to understand what's going on. You're not going to be able to predict what's going to happen, and you're not going to be able to provide appropriate treatment. So my number one reason is that we can use Donald Trump to learn about ADHD, to understand about ADHD. And the second, and this is important, but it's less important to me, is that you can use ADHD to understand Donald Trump. Because if you don't get that piece of him, and there have been several psychological profiles, other descriptions of him, and it doesn't hang together, it doesn't make sense unless you include ADHD. And I would argue the ADHD, because ADHD affects how you process all the information coming into your brain, and it affects everything that's leaving your brain, that ADHD actually underlies all of his other possible mental health disorders. So the other thing I'm going to say is when I'm saying this is to help educate people about ADHD, this is in the spirit of the public service announcements we make regarding teaching people about the signs of a heart attack or the signs of a stroke. We're not separate from the individual criteria. There's some crucial structure for this diagnosis. So the structure is these symptoms have to show a persistent pattern. So Attitude magazine, the first year Trump was in office, had a brilliant, in some ways, article giving exquisitely detailed descriptions of each of these, or almost all these 18 points, 15 or 16 of them, a beautiful anecdote in great detail about how it matched up with this particular symptom. The problem with that is that that's focusing on just one little incident, and ADHD does not have what we call any pathognomonic criteria or symptoms, which means, unlike schizophrenia, where someone who is hallucinating and talking aloud to themselves in psychotic gibberish language, that is a strong indicative that that person has schizophrenia. All of the symptoms for ADHD are things that normal people do occasionally. So with ADHD, they have to have a persistent pattern. And I'm not going to highlight too many specific patterns or specific incidents or anecdotes, because I want you to be thinking, does this person, Donald Trump, fit this persistent pattern? Does he do this over and over and over again? Not whether he does it dramatically at one time. So a few other things. These behaviors, we're comparing that person's age group. So Donald Trump is often compared to a 2-year-old.
Right. So this psychiatrist has a whole series of thoughtful videos on Donald Trump and ADHD. Hilarious article by the author of the book American Carnage, Tim Alberta. Now he's published a thoughtful essay in The Atlantic inside the ruthless, restless final days of Trump's campaign. And it talks about just helps so much of the past 4 months become much more understandable. At the end of June, in the afterglow of his devastating debate performance that would eventually prompt President Joe Biden to end his campaign for re-election, Donald Trump startled his aides by announcing that he'd come up with a new nickname for his opponent. The guy's a retard. He's retarded. I think that's what I'll start calling him, Trump declared aboard his campaign plane. Retarded Joe Biden. Right, this is someone with ADHD would come up with. The staffers present, and everyone who heard about it, pled with Trump not to say this. They warned him it would antagonize the moderate voters who'd been breaking in his direction. It would engender sympathy for his opponent. And his staffers were puzzled over the timing, right? Polls showed that Donald Trump was jumping out to the biggest lead that he'd ever enjoyed. Everything was going right for Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Why would he jeopardize all of that for the sake of slinging a juvenile insult? And eventually his aides realized that Donald Trump is restless, unhappy, and tired of winning. For the previous 20 months, he'd been hemmed in by a campaign built on the principles of restraint and competence. His ugliest impulses were regularly curbed by his top advisors. His most obnoxious allies and most outlandish ideas were sidelined. These guardrails produced a professional campaign, a campaign headed for victory. But now, like a predator toying with its wound to catch, Trump had become bored. Reminded some allies of his havoc-making decisions in the White House. Donald Trump never had much use for calm and quiet. Right? He did not appreciate normalcy. He could not stand being babysat. Right? Donald Trump clearly has ADHD. Now, Donald Trump did not deploy this nickname against Joe Biden in public. But the restiveness that he felt during that stretch of the race when he was most in charge, right, foretold what was going to happen over the next few months. Trump has become increasingly agitated with what he saw as the trust the plan, run out the clock strategy of his campaign, and he became increasingly convinced this cautious approach was going to cost him a second term, which is why he brought in his old friend Corey Lewandowski, who tried to take over the campaign until Susie Wiles sat Trump down and essentially said, it's either me running the show or I'm out of here. So Donald Trump does not handle tedium or boredom very well, right? He has a tremendous appetite for chaos that likely comes out of his ADHD. So for the first 10 days following Joe Biden's departure from the race, Donald Trump listened dutifully to the instructions from Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita. They said the fundamentals of their strategy remained solid, nothing dramatic needed to change. They argued that whatever enthusiasm was now out there for Kamala Harris, that would evaporate. Just stay the course. That's a sure recipe for electoral success. Donald Trump went along with this for 10 days, but he was increasingly upset. So finally, July 31, during an onstage interview with the National Association of Black Journalists, Donald Trump publicly unloaded with the sort of race-baiting barbs that his aides had, until this point, succeeding in containing to his private diatribes. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, Donald Trump told the journalists. Right, so in the days after this appearance, Donald Trump began to lose confidence in his team of Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita, because Kamala Harris was climbing rapidly in the polls and his own favorability was dropping. So in early August, Trump reached out to two of his longtime allies, 2016 campaign manager Kellyanne Conway and Corey Lewandowski. And he talked to them about them joining his campaign. Donald Trump missed the freewheeling fun of his first run for the White House. He thought he was being overly managed by his current team. Now, Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita are tough people, right? They are not easily made insecure and anxious. Right? Corey Lewandowski came back. He promised Donald Trump would return to the killer vibes of 2016. Corey Lewandowski joined the campaign and then began telling everyone that he outranked everyone else, that he was the key spokesman for Donald Trump. Corey Lewandowski was telling friends that Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita were trying to sabotage him, and Corey Lewandowski went down to the Palm Beach headquarters and telling everyone that he was in charge. During the week of the Democratic National Convention, Donald Trump shared a social media post suggesting that Kamala Harris had performed oral sex in exchange for career advancement. He said a lot of other crazy things. He called into Fox News' coverage of the Democratic Convention, and he rambled so incoherently that anchors cut his line 10 minutes into the interview, and then Donald Trump promptly dialed Newsmax to continue his rant. So when he was at a rally in North Carolina, he polled the audience about whether he should get personal, and the crowd encouraged him yes. Then he started publicly musing about firing his advisors. So Donald Trump, as Kamala Harris was rising in the polls, Donald Trump was dropping because he became increasingly undisciplined. Then a couple of months after J.D. Vance was nominated as the vice president, he heard this story about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, that they were eating the dogs, they were eating the pets, they were eating the cats, the pets, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people that live there. And it was one particular advisor who'd given this to J.D. Vance, Alex Brucewitz, who also apparently, according to this article, booked the insult comic Tony Hinchcliffe at the Madison Square Garden rally last Sunday. Hinchcliffe insulted Puerto Ricans and a bunch of other groups and instigated a whole series of news cycles that focused on this shock humor. Trump found the eating the dogs, eating the pets shtick irresistible. He couldn't help bringing it out in the debate. And several days earlier, just before the debate, he fielded a phone call from one of his superfans, Laura Loomer. Right? She was one of Trump's biggest supporters, but Trump's aides did not want her around. Right? She talked about how 9/11 was an inside job. And Laura Loomer was getting antsy. She called Trump. She demanded to know why the Trump campaign had been keeping her at bay. Why hasn't she been allowed back on the plane with Donald Trump? Trump told Laura Loomer not to worry. He would see to it that she'd be on board the plane. And so Trump relayed this request to Susie Wiles, who registered disbelief. And Susie Wiles knew that nothing good would come from saying no to Donald Trump, and nothing good would come of having Laura Loomer on the plane, so she just gave in. She decided Laura Loomer was not the hill to die on. So you had all these photographers capturing Laura Loomer disembarking on the Trump plane, and Donald Trump's allies were just absolutely aghast. Now, how did they finally get Laura Loomer off the Trump plane? Right, his aides would keep bringing printouts of some of her most outrageous posts, but that did not do it. Right, what did it is people pointed out that she'd had too much plastic surgery. And finally, there was a big confrontation with Corey Lewandowski and Susie Wiles, and Trump eventually sided with Susie Wiles. So September 12th, Susie Wiles told Trump, "This can't go on." And she gave essentially Donald Trump an ultimatum. If you don't have confidence in me and Chris LaCivita, just say so. She gave the ultimatum. Donald Trump struggled with the decision, decided to keep Susie Wiles, Chris LaCivita, and to essentially banish Corey Lewandowski. So Lewandowski was no longer on the campaign plane. Things stabilized from there. And Donald Trump, since they got rid of Corey Lewandowski, Donald Trump's campaign seems to have been consistently in a winning position. So Trump, from the middle of September to the middle of October, operated in the disciplined fashion that Susie Wiles wanted. And as a result, all sorts of Republican candidates requested joint appearances. So they didn't want to campaign with crazy Donald Trump, but they were happy to campaign with a more disciplined Donald Trump. When Donald Trump was on stage for 40 minutes just swaying to the music, the aides decided it was better to let him dance on stage than let him rant. A week later, Donald Trump left aides slack-jawed by marveling at the ample genitalia of the late golfer legend Arnold Palmer. So even as the political class settled on Donald Trump as the betting favorite, his allies could not shake a pair of bad feelings. First was the ground game, where Democrats have the advantage. And the second concern is all the chaos and acrimony that travels with Trump everywhere. So Corey Lewandowski was reported to have carried on a romantic relationship with South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem. She boarded the Trump plane at one point, and she started contradicting the things that Susie Wiles was telling Donald Trump. She was trying to make Corey Lewandowski look good and make Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita look bad. October 15, the Daily Beast published an explosive story alleging that Chris LaCivita skimmed huge amounts of money from the Donald Trump campaign. Trump was livid. They eventually had a sit-down, and Chris LaCivita brought all the documents and made the case that the report was exaggerated and the air was cleared. So Chris LaCivita always saw himself as a hired gun. He'd always had reservations about working Donald Trump. The word that Donald Trump had almost iced Chris LaCivita sent a shiver through the rest of the staff. Every staffer felt that they'd be under a microscope through Election Day. Now, I noticed something in conversations with numerous Trump staffers: resignation. They'd become accustomed to working in the high-intensity, zero-margin error environment created by Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita, but the home stretch of the campaign hadn't just been hard and stressful, it had been disillusioning. They had been initially excited to work in the next Trump White House. Now, the same people were telling me that they'd had a change of heart. The past 3 months have been the most unpleasant of their careers. Win or lose, they were done with the chaos of Donald Trump, even if the nation was not. Right, Tim Alberta there, writing thoughtful essay in The Atlantic.
That also kind of backfires, though, because if you're asking people to think back to the Trump years and their top issue is inflation, they're going to remember something that is rosier. And, it's not to say people weren't still suffering, but after COVID, what happened with inflation, some of it under Donald Trump's watch, some of it understandable, whether the president had been a Republican or a Democrat, because of the nature of the crisis, it spikes. And Biden is the one who inherits that country as it's spiking. You can have a debate about whether the administration exacerbated that or eased it. But the fact of the matter is it continued to go up. And even as it started to dip, it still didn't get below the level of pre-COVID. And just the final point would be there are also really significant areas where these prices have continued to go up instead of dropping at all. Swing districts.
Killer quote from Donald Trump in this Tim Alberta article, where Donald Trump says on stage, "What's discipline got to do with winning?" Donald Trump, classic ADHD poster child, does not enjoy discipline.
Districts, let's say Las Vegas suburbs, Las Vegas itself.
Cost of living is so high that I live from paycheck to paycheck and I can barely make it.
Yolanda Perkins' story is becoming all too common across Southern Nevada.
Are you having to readjust your budgeting just to afford the roof over your head?
Yes, and I work 2 jobs. I make over $5,000 per month and I cannot make it.
Breaking news, and it appears home prices in Southern Nevada are nearing a record high. We're getting the latest report just out this morning from the Las Vegas Realtors Association. They're saying the median price of a single-family home here sold in Southern Nevada last month, $480,000, you guys, and that's extremely close.
Phoenix in Arizona. There are places where housing is through the roof.
Tonight, concerning numbers are shedding new light on the affordability crisis in Arizona, as nearly half of all renters in the state are spending more than 30% of their income on housing.
How much are you paying for rent right now?
Right now, $753 per month.
And how much do you get a month?
$918.
$918. So you're spending almost 75% of your income on rent?
Yes.
How do you survive?
I just, you know.
It's not across the board and it's not everywhere in the country, but there are certain pockets of the economy that are very important to voters.
All right, fascinating essay in Jacobin, this left-wing publication, The Right Without Wrong. For decades, liberals had hoped for the de-Christianization of the American right. It's not all that it was cracked up to be. So it talks about Simone Collins, a candidate for state representative in Pennsylvania. In many ways, she sounds like a typical Republican, mother of 4, an adoring wife. But in one crucial regard, she's very different. She is an atheist. So a Pennsylvania Republican running openly as an atheist would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. Now, for many on the left, this is a great development, right? They're sick of Christianity. But for secular liberals who have made believing science their own kind of religion, the possible waning of Christian conservatism may seem like a blessing long overdue, but what if it isn't? So for all the secular liberals who are into believing science, they don't believe the science of IQ differences among different groups. For decades, the United States has been becoming more secular and less church-going. And the secularization has not eluded the Republican Party. Right, the rise of the non-religious right is the story of the Trump coalition. So the less religious Republicans get, the more they support Donald Trump. Many of Trump's most visible celebrity supporters, from Kanye West to Dave Portnoy, are definitely not religious. So Trump is as much a reflection of his movement as he is a leader of it. And he has moderated the Republican platform on various moral issues such as abortion and gay marriage and divorce. So today's right is quite far from being Christian censorious scolds. It's now somewhat transgressive. Triggering the libs has become a favorite pastime of many right-wingers, not just in the United States, but also abroad. So the secularization of the right, you'd think, would be welcomed by the left, but maybe not so much. Right? Christopher Rufo, conservative activist, rarely mentions faith or God or Christian values. Said he warns of civilizational suicide. He complains the left is full of incompetent diversity hires, overweight, ugly, mentally unstable, cross-dressing, low IQ people. During the Democratic National Convention, right-wing activists mercilessly mocked Tim Walz's stupid, crying son as a puffy beta male and a blubbering bitch boy. 17-year-old kid has a learning disability. So the youthful, exuberant, forward-looking conservatives of tomorrow have cranked up their enthusiasm while abandoning even a nominal Christian commitment to compassion and love of the victim, the neighbor, the immigrant, and the poor. Ross Douthat warned in 2016, if you dislike the religious right, wait until you meet the post-religious right. 3 of the most viral anti-Christian writers, Curtis Yarvin, Richard Hanania, and Costin Alamario, better known as Bronze Age pervert, all disdain Christianity. Right, Hanania is much more into Nietzsche. Curtis Yarvin describes himself as unforgivably materialist and completely soulless. So these irreligious voices are shaping much of American conservative thought. When Donald Trump was asked what he makes of the Democratic charge that Republicans are weird, he threw his religious running mate under the bus. Not about me, Trump retorted. They're saying that about JD, who's a passionate convert to Roman Catholicism. So the new thinkers of the dissident right are often channeling older anti-egalitarians such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Julius Evola, Oswald Spengler, and Carl Schmitt. Sam Francis wrote in 2004, Christianity today is the enemy of the West and the race that created it. So it is civilizational and racial anxiety that emanates much of the post-religious right today. And without the Christian appeals to goodness, love, and equality, right, you can look at it as an icy nihilism taking hold on the hard right's rejection of Christianity. Steve Saylor, once obscure blogger, was denounced in National Review as recently as 2005 for shockingly racist missives, is now credited as the man who invented identity politics for the new right. He went on Tucker Carlson. He coined the term human biodiversity as a way of linking heritable traits to myriad forms of inequality. The implication is clear. If the immense degree of inequality we witness in today's Gilded Age is the result of natural differences in IQ, then there isn't much to be done about it. Moreover, why should we? This is quite different from squaring that with the message of Christianity. And so for the left, the return of racialism is frightening. The title of Tom Wolfe's last novel is Back to Blood. So if your primary identity isn't religious, it's very likely to be racial. Without Christianity, the right inevitably veers into the darkest corners of violent, naturalistic chauvinism. And here are Steve Saylor's thoughts on this essay. He says, I quite like this essay. Steve Saylor notes that Curtis Yarvin, Richard Hanania, and Bronze Age pervert are pretty marginal figures, except among high IQ controversialists, where their extremely high IQs make them stand out. Steve Saylor says, I never heard of Carl Schmitt until the turn of the century. Didn't hear of Julius Evola until a decade ago, along with Spengler, who I had heard about when I was young but never read. They all seem deeply uncongenial to me. They also seem weird to me. Now, with the internet and the increasing global pervasiveness of the English language, many American writers have been introduced to far more continental intellectuals than in the past. So when I was younger, Saylor notes, American conservative intellectuals tended towards Anglophilia, right? Love of the Anglo-Saxons, love of Britain. Thinkers like Edmund Burke, Adam Smith, Charles Darwin, Francis Galton, Winston Churchill, G.K. Chesterton, Evelyn Waugh, and George Orwell. Steve Saylor is no big fan of Nietzsche. Saylor says, I've always found racial gaps in IQ to be like the racial gaps in running speed. Pretty obvious, but hardly the end of the world. Every evening on ESPN SportsCenter, we see ample evidence of genetic differences among the races in athletic schools. Yet we all seem pretty cool with it, which is good. So Steve attests his noticing of racial gaps in sports he attributes to attending at age 9, 1968 college football game at Los Angeles Coliseum, where in the first half, Oregon State's white star fullback Billy Enyart brutalized the USC defensive line with his upper body strength. But in the second half, USC's black superstar tailback O.J. Simpson overwhelmed OSU's defense with his world-class sprinter speed, rushing for a career-high 238 yards. And he also remembers the 1966 World Series when I was 7. when the Baltimore Orioles swept the Los Angeles Dodgers. Baltimore were led by two hard-hitting, hard-throwing stars named Robinson. And the black one played in the outfield because he was faster. And Brooks Robinson, the white guy, played in the infield. When I started reading social science about bell curves in 1972 at age 13, Steve Saylor says, all this sports noticing from the 1960s started to make perfect sense to me. Funny thing is that lowbrow Will Stansel, who despises race science of sports talk radio, is the only one who gets that I'm basically a sports fan rather than some deranged fascist highbrow. Something can be true in sports where we have a huge number of statistics about group differences. Why can't it be true in the social sciences as well?
Where those prices are going up, there's no relief. They're not coming down at all. That's why you start to see both candidates talking a lot about housing. It's just one example of where prices are still a really sore spot for many, many voters, despite an overall decline.
Right. I mean, even if you just look at the numbers around housing, they have gone way up all over the country, not just in big cities, but in smaller towns, in the suburbs, and not just by 10, 15, 20%. In some cases, they have doubled or gone up even more than that just since 2019. And then beyond rents, there's the enormous skyrocketing costs of buying a home. And I think that has led to a lot of gloom and hopelessness among many Americans who are worried that they will never be able to afford a home, worried that we live in a country where you have to be a millionaire just to buy a house. And all of this has happened while Biden was in office. And rightly or wrongly, I think that he and his administration.
So reflecting more on those two articles, and I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist. I grew up in a high-intensity religious environment, and religiosity was the number one lens through which I saw the world. So it makes sense to me, if you're intensely religious, religion will be the primary lens through which you see the world. But if you're not intensely religious, then increasingly your racial group will be a lens through which you see the world.
And other Democrats have been perceived as downplaying or, shrugging off just how devastating this has been for so many Americans.
Yeah, I think inflation teaches us that instead of looking at the whole question, like how can this guy with multiple indictments and saying the things he did and leaving office, really unpopular, add to the litany of demerits for Donald Trump, how could this guy be poised to win or almost winning? Flip it and say, how could it be that in a Western election where all the Western elections have gone against the incumbent, where people, especially the people who aren't invested in things like abstract notions of democracy, just want their lives to be better, and where there was a president who removed himself or was removed late in the game, and then someone who no one voted for got to be the nominee, which we'll get to. How could it be the case that that party that was in charge during inflation and that couldn't even get their act together or who their nominee was, how could that party be
let's bring
almost
Kip
winning or
back
maybe
to
winning?
the show.
And so that's another
Kip,
way to look at it.
What's going on, bro? Long time no talk.
Yeah, man. Did you have a good week?
I did. Go Dodgers. We won the World Series.
That's true. I don't know if you won it so much as they lost it. I mean, you put them in that 3-0 hole. That was the done deal. But they pretty much gave away that game 5, didn't they?
That was amazing. I turned that game off because the Dodgers were down 5-0. I thought, why should I bother watching it? But I just kept checking my phone every half hour. And then when I saw the Dodgers coming back, I watched the whole 17-minute inning where there were 3 key Yankee errors. Unbelievable.
What was the name of that center fielder that blew that?
Aaron Judge.
Routine?
Routine fly ball.
What I really loved is how those jackass announcers talk about a Judgian home run, a Stantonian blast. And then you watch that. Where's that Judgian gaff? You know what I mean? Let's highlight that Judgian gaff. So they really blew it. And it seems like, at least in baseball, that errors like that are a lot more highlighted than they were maybe 20 or 30 years ago. There seems to be a smaller margin for error. You get what I'm saying?
Interesting. I haven't watched that much baseball over the last 20 years. I turned it on basically for the playoffs, so I'm not so up to date.
Yeah, I used to be the biggest Orioles fan in the world, and when I became an adult, I pretty much dropped it at about 25 for some reason. But I was feeling a little bit melancholy today. I almost didn't want to call you because
Wait, one more thought on sports. I moved to Australia for a year, and it's amazing what it does to you when you move, because it substantially lessened my sports addiction, because I moved to a different country. So that was when I came back, and I think the St. Louis Cardinals and Kansas City Royals met in the World Series, and it was the first time in years that I didn't watch the World Series. That the habits that I got into in America were broken by spending time in Australia, and my allegiances and fixations were often shattered, and I got to remake myself anew. Okay, back to you.
Yeah, that makes sense, though. That makes sense. But the reason I was melancholy and almost didn't call you today is some guy about 3 miles away from me had died, and they had posted a sign that they were going to sell the house at auction. And that didn't work out the way I had hoped. You get what I'm saying? I won't bore you with all the details, but the whole thing just struck me as just such a sad affair that his 70 whatever years on earth had been reduced to this. But this fella apparently had moved here from California 20 years ago and had like a $6,500 retirement coming to him every month.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you want to talk about buying happiness. His son had come up from Atlanta, I guess, with his wife, and they filled up 2 U-Hauls and took them back to Atlanta with the good stuff. And I mean, the rest of it was just laid out on the yard and in his garage. And it's just amazing to see that everything that he paid good money for was reduced to pennies on the dollar, you know? Strangely enough, now I don't know if you've ever been to estate sales. This was my first one, but I expected that the things you ought to be able to get a deal on is the more expensive things, and that the lower end things you might get in a bidding war on, because everybody's got a $20 bill in their pocket, you know. But who's got 250,000, you know, sitting around? But strangely enough, it seemed to go opposite. They were almost giving away all his personal effects, which might be $500 telescope still in a box, and all kinds of stuff. He had more. To me, he had 10 men's worth of possessions. And then when I heard that the family had loaded up 2 U-Hauls full of things, it just blew me away. So I hated to see that.
Did he live alone? Did he live alone?
I think he did. It just blew me away to know that someone had been to a Walmart or wherever, went online and paid $100,000 for stuff that people just maybe paid $1,500 total for, you know. But then when it got to the house, all of a sudden people started bidding, putting their hands up, 300,000, 310,000, 320,000. They just left me in the dust. You know what I mean? And when it came to things like a 10-year-old pickup truck, the bid was going 14,000, 15,000. It was going on and on. And I would have thought that big things, big ticket items would be the deal, might be able to be made. But no, when you go back and play it back in reverse, the people who was getting the deals was the people who was getting whole boxfuls of 100-year-old unopened Coca-Colas for $5 a box, you know, whole boxfuls of shotgun shells or ammo, you know, for $5 a box. Big boxes, you know, cardboard boxes of things just filled with stuff. And just to think that he had probably paid $100,000, maybe $200,000 for all that stuff that got scooped up for almost nothing.
Now,
So,
what precisely about it made you sad? Because there's nothing inherent in what happened that necessarily made you sad. There was something in everything you just described that got to you. What was it?
Oh, the whole element that poor guy was 70-something years old, and he he had brought all that clutter upon himself. I mean, it was nice shit, Luke, don't get me wrong. But it don't matter if it's nice shit or if it's not nice shit. He had so much clutter around himself. Somebody like me was like, man, this dude must have been trying to buy happiness. You know, what was he clutching and clinging for with all this stuff? You know, with all this stuff. It's okay to have one air compressor, but why you got 6 of them? You know, it's okay to have like one tall ladder and one normal size ladder, but why is there 10 of them? You know, it just went on, and the telescopes and the train sets, and he must have been a fireman because it had all kinds of collectibles. That was the one weird thing, made me think of Elliot too. The one weird thing where I saw bidding wars erupting is the bins full of Hot Wheels and stuff, anything that he had related to being a fireman or whatever. And you could tell this guy must have just been passing his time and trying to get his jollies off, just buying shit off eBay or whatever. Just at all time. He must have been buying something every day, you know, to accumulate all the things he had accumulated. So that just seems...
And do you have a problem with clutter and hoarding?
No. I'm probably the exact opposite of that. I maybe I did at one time, but I had lived almost a decade on a houseboat, and that'll force you to you'll cure whatever you got as far as clutter, you know, if you want to be able to like live on a houseboat, because it's only like 400 or 500 square feet to begin with, you know.
So I would challenge you that the reason you're sad about this guy had nothing to do with what you just said. There was something in his story that made you reflect on your own life, that there was something going on there that has to do with you, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the material goods. I'll give you an example. I remember in therapy, one session, I was going on and on about a friend of mine who was converting to Orthodox Judaism, and the therapist says, why are you so concerned about this person? And I finally got around to it. Because she reminds me of me. So what was it in his demise and in his life that perhaps forced you to confront something about your own life?
You know, is this what it's reduced down to? You know, just a bunch of stuff, just playing the game. Are they that serious? Is everybody that serious, you know, about the game of just stuff, just completely filling their house to the brim with stuff? And plus, it got me thinking other things. It got me thinking like what Elliot talks about. Remember, we was on the phone with him a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about somebody in a grown-up person having like a toy or whatever, you know, on his desk at work or whatever. And it made me think the world has changed, Luke Ford, on us. What people care about.
One thing that hasn't changed is that you still haven't put a battery in your fire alarm.
Yeah, that's true. And I went to Walmart too. I forgot mouthwash, and I'll be paying for that here in about 2 or 3 days here if I don't run back and get some batteries and mouthwash. But it made me think, what kind of strange, eclectic shit are we going to find at estate sales in 40 or 50 years from now that everybody has taken their indulgences to the nth degree, you know, where they cosplay this and, you know, do all this stuff. It's going to be just estate sales are going to be ridiculous, you know. But I don't know.
But the saddest thing about your neighbor's demise is that it sounds like he wasn't much connected to other people, and he was lonely, and he was trying to fill that loneliness with a bunch of stuff.
I don't know. I mean, I didn't ask. He could have had a wife that had preceded him in death. I don't know. I just know he had been on the mountain here for 21 years, which is apparently a long time, because it hadn't been settled for that long up here. But one of the things that you and I differ 180 degrees on is you say people did not evolve to be gullible.
Yes.
And I say when I see the Democratic Party and all the shit that guy had acquired over the years, I tend to believe you're totally wrong about that. That people did evolve to be gullible, and you know, we can agree that it keeps you from getting run over, or it keeps you from touching a hot stove because your parents are telling you things, you know. And so you're thinking like Luke Ford that you've shaken all that off as you've become an adult. But I don't think that's necessarily true with all people. In fact, I don't think it's true with most people.
Well, I was just noticing over the Jewish holidays how much I had not shaken off from my Australian heritage, because I was talking to this woman, a very beautiful, classy, well-dressed, successful, affluent woman, about cultural differences between Australia and America. And I realized when it came to dating that I was very much in line with Australian dating habits. Australian men are about the laziest daters in the world. And so I recognize my own very lazy approach to dating, essentially, in all likelihood, came out of my Australian cultural heritage. So I am constantly realizing and being surprised by how I've just carried on without thinking habits that I just ingested without ever analyzing. For example, my vegetarian diet, it was being an absolute disaster for my health, but I just carried it on without thinking. So when I say that we did not evolve to be gullible, I'm saying that it's really hard to manipulate other people. And it's really hard to be manipulated against your most profound interests. Now, even though my vegetarian diet has harmed me, right, I was still on track to live to about 90 years of age, just not with the degree of health that I would have had if I'd led a normal life. But let's develop this question about, did people evolve to be gullible? I find it's really hard to manipulate other people against their self-interest. What's your own track record? Do you feel like you are an effective manipulator of others when you want to be?
I used to be. I told you I left all that behind like in 2007 because I could see it for what it is. But when you're on the other end of the fence and you're reverse engineering, how do you get the customer to say yes 100 times out of 100 times? It's easy to justify because you got mouths to feed, you know, and you can console yourself with the fact that all that bullshit that you told the customer, some of that had to be true. You know what I mean? Some of that stuff, but what I'm telling you is anytime a salesman's calling on you, the devil's into the details. He's forgotten more about the details than you'll ever know. And it's the things a lot of times that don't even come up, you know, that are the important things that they will be able to gloss right over because, hey, that maybe that's where they've lost a sale or two before. So it just won't come up. So just to tell you how gullible I think people are, usually when I used to train loan officers, and I trained them to go, instead of trying to get, I wanted them to close the loan in our office, but I wanted them to go to people's house and get a look at the property and get the people as comfortable as possible by doing the appointments in their living room. So when we would do that, if it was the first couple of times, I would accompany the loan officer. But after that, I would let them go on their own. But to make life easier for them, I would go down there everywhere that a person's supposed to sign. I would take my yellow highlighter and put an X beside their name, and I would arrange the paperwork in a way that was easy to digest information first. And anything that I thought might cause a conflict, I hid that as like the 35th or 40th paper that they were going to have to sign. And you'd be surprised. And then I would usually train the loan officer something basic on saying, if the customer does not turn into a machine and just start signing everything without reading, I want you to pull the paperwork back and I want you to say, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, as long as you pay your bill on time, as long as you pay this mortgage on time, ain't nothing in this paperwork going to hurt you, Mr. Jones. But Mr. Jones, if you don't make that mortgage payment on time, ain't nothing in this paperwork going to save you. And it's as simple as that. And then you hold those papers in front of them again, and you watch 9 times out of 10, Mr. Jones will just start signing where the highlight is, and just you pick up the paper, he signs the next one. You pick up the paper, he signs the next one. People are very robotic. They're very programmable and manipulable. And that's a credit to you that you find that hard to believe, because you obviously do, right? Right, Luke?
Well, I would contend to you that for at least 90% of these people, the mortgage that you were selling them was not dramatically against their self-interest, that it was against their self-interest only on the margins. What percentage of the people would you say that signing this particular mortgage with you was dramatically against their interest?
Probably at least half of them.
Okay, and so what would have the alternative been? They would have bought another mortgage from someone else. They wanted a mortgage. So how dramatic a difference? You said it's a dramatic difference that you were selling them an inferior product compared to what they would have gotten elsewhere. And I don't believe that, but tell me, what were the dramatic differences if they'd shopped elsewhere?
Well, if they're lucky, they could find something for 1% origination. But I did loans in the world where I could charge 10% origination.
That's because you're dealing with people with really bad credit. I mean, no one with good credit. No one with good credit is going to pay a 10% origination. I mean, if they've got solid background. I mean, you're a mortgage broker. And so mortgage brokers overwhelmingly deal with people with less than stellar credit.
Yeah, at one time. But I'm just telling you, that doesn't always, people, there's different programs. They might have different needs. And like I'm telling you, I just taught different ways where you could take the customer out of the market to where I would just tell my loan officers and just assume that they're shopping you. And then A, B, C, and D, this is the best ways to try to take them out of the market. Now, it's been so long since I did that, it'd be hard for me to regurgitate that to you right now. But it's true. It's true, Luke. And it's just that, and look at any white man on the Democrat Party if he goes out and works, why would he be, why would Tim Walz, he naturally shouldn't be a Democrat. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Do you recognize that different people experience life differently? That different people have different types of cognitive apparatus, like different people have different size amygdala. The bigger the amygdala, the more you're going to be afraid of certain things, so you'll be more likely to be conservative. So if different people experience life differently, it's not surprising that some people will have different politics.
And I will tell you that part of being gullible, that if you have had the tougher side of life, been on the wrong side of the tracks for part of your life or most of your life, you are going to naturally be gullible because you're going to be looking for help all the time. And you'll take a little bit of bullshit if 75% of the time it's going to be a net help to you. So again, this probably goes down to your particular raising. But I would have thought, I don't know, with you having those 4 wannabe moms along the way, I would have thought you would have noticed some differences in people. But you were so young. Wasn't that from like 3 years to 7 years? You were pretty young when that was happening.
The first 4.5 years is where I had all the different mothers. But which people did you say would be particularly vulnerable, gullible? Those from the wrong end of the tracks?
Yeah, I would say that anytime that you are needing help from people, that you can't do it on your own, which is naturally going to be lower IQ people. Yeah. Those are going to be the people that are going to be naturally gullible because they're going to turn the other cheek because 4 out of 5 times the guy really is bringing them coffee and a sandwich. He's only fucking them over 1 out of 5 times. Pardon my French. So that's one. It's one place that I think we definitely see different on. And
let me jump in there. I have completely different life experience. I find lower IQ people are much more surly and distrusting. And the higher the IQ person I interact with, the bigger the chances that he will be trusting, because the higher your IQ, the more you recognize the devastating price to be paid if the other party behaves in an untrustworthy manner. So if I meet someone at synagogue or in yoga or in a high IQ setting, right, people will open up their hearts, will open up their lives, will open up their legs, will open up their homes far, far more trusting than when I meet people with IQs below 100, because the higher the IQ, the more likely you are to recognize the virtue of win-win solutions, and the more clearly you see the devastating price that would be paid if the other party breaks your confidence. So if you meet someone in a fellow IQ setting, it doesn't mean that you give them $1 million, but you'll be much more likely to open up to them, to invite them to something, because you both will recognize that the price to be paid for betraying trust is so huge that a sane person would avoid doing it in that sort of situation where you see people on an ongoing basis. So I overwhelmingly find lower IQ people to be surly, and the higher the IQ person, the much more likely they are to be open, trusting, and vulnerable. Appropriate levels of vulnerability.
Right. Yeah.
Because the lower IQ people, they get screwed over. They know they're not very smart, and they have been screwed over again and again and again and again. So they just have a surly, distrustful disposition that makes interacting with them quite unpleasant, generally.
Well, life is cheap in a jogger neighborhood because somebody with nothing to lose is a problem. They are a problem. They are a problem. And unfortunately, the little societal handrails that with all the handouts and stuff, they're making it now to where someone can actually live that way. You get what I'm saying? They're not having any skin in the game, but still get their EBT cards and still get this or that. And these people are a problem because you don't have really, what are you going to call them into court and take from them if they do something wrong to you? They got nothing. That makes them a problem. So I don't know.
I'm continually surprised how open, trusting, vulnerable, high IQ people are that I meet. And it's just relentlessly depressing to interact with the surly, low IQ crowd, where they just have this huge chip on their shoulder because they know they're not very smart, right? They know that they can't see things as clearly as the people who are smarter than them. And so they just have this surly, distrustful disposition. While I'll meet, someone who's high IQ, and like we can start sharing and making plans and bonding relatively quickly, particularly if it's in a place like a synagogue where each person's a known factor.
Right. I was reading up on some thought from the Corpus Hermeticum, and I was wondering how this would play out with you. The way they see it is we're all, when Luke Ford was born, 66, you were born in 66, right?
Yep.
The stars were arranged just a very certain way at the time of your birth. And then, hours later, even minutes later, the constellations, everything's changed a little bit. So the way they would see you, me, everyone, is that those constellations, they have effects on you. And let's say for you or me, some of them might affect us in a way of like, I guess you would say your passions or emotions, they would like affect you through fear, or maybe through anger, or through lust, or maybe something like envy or grief, or the want for wealth or power or whatever. If that was true, if that was true, that Luke Ford, just from a celestial standpoint, had something, had something working against him, which one of those things, which one of the passions you think, is there a theme in your own life as to maybe which of the passions has tugged at you the hardest?
Oh, definitely. Passion for attention, and just varieties of the passion for attention.
And maybe a little bit of lust too.
A whole lot of lust, but that's a subset of the passion for attention, right? I don't have lust for intimate interactions where the other party's paying zero attention for me. That's not my experience.
Let me pay you a compliment. I went to check to see if he was having a show one night, and I don't know what. I wound up somewhere, and it was like you in an interview from 2005. That dude still had some boyish good looks. You remember that dude named Luke Ford, 2005?
Yeah, well, it's more that I see video of myself today, and I go like, "Whoa, who's that old dude?"
No. But what I'm saying is, you at 2005, damn, you were pushing 40 then, though, right?
Yeah, I was a good-looking guy until about 2012. That's when I began to noticeably age.
Yeah, now they have, I don't know, depending on people's proclivity, they got Tinders and grinders and all this kind of stuff. And apparently it works pretty bad for the people who aren't good looking or whatever. But I'm wondering how much different that was from the nightclubs, because I think to myself, the guys that went to nightclubs and wasn't getting any action, well, what are they going to do? Subject themselves to that every Friday and Saturday? Hell no, they're not going to. They're going to do other things. Only the people at the clubs think they're worthy of action. Does that make sense to you?
Wow, that's a big topic. So it's a horrible, horrible feeling when you realize that you are trying to hang out in a space with people for whom you're not a fit. I mean, when you interrupt a conversation where you're not wanted, where you're hanging out in a nightclub that is overwhelmingly for a much younger age group, it is just a horrible feeling, and very few people can sustain and plug through that horrible feeling. You would just normally shift where you try to meet women. Right? There are other places to meet women aside from a nightclub, and so the aging bachelor such as myself, all right, we go to other places. We go to yoga, we go to classes, we go to volunteering, we go to synagogue and Jewish events, we go on trips. Right, there are a lot of other ways to meet women.
But yeah. So you're saying if a guy keeps striking out at the nightclubs, he's going to try another avenue of approach. He's going to try the Sunday school scene or some other scene to see if he can lock down a wife that way.
Yeah, I mean, yoga was a revelation. That was an amazing place to meet women.
Oh, and you said some guy had a little angle working the secret to get laid, right? Tell me about that.
Yeah, my friend Kevin Blatt, he's best known as a broker on celebrity sex tapes. So someone's caught in a celebrity sex tape, they'll usually pay off the person who has it so it doesn't get made public. And he's been a broker in that world, but he's worked in and around the sex trade for many years, and he has the gift of the gab. I remember one night he was talking in Mary Carey and ended up going to bed with Mary Carey, a porn star who ran for governor of California in 2003. And about 1 a.m., she woke up and she said to him, "Are you a rapist?" Because she didn't know who he was. But yeah, anyway, not a great looking guy, but just a guy with a gift of the gab. And he swears that he was able to use the secret to sleep with all sorts of women.
Right. Okay. So when he was running that little spiel on them, were the Mary Careys of the world being gullible, or was he just giving them what they wanted? He was just fulfilling.
I understand it far more the latter, but I have a bias. I prefer to analyze things that happen through an analysis of people trying to meet their needs the best way they know how.
Right. But backing up just a little bit, that is kind of a weird concept, that it's the constellations themselves that have unique effects on each of us, and some of which, so maybe some of those passions that get the best of people, and then I guess it comes down to, remember, I kind of, to you, I call it a roller coaster. I guess it comes down to, are you having fun? Is it a fun roller coaster? Do you want to keep playing that game or whatever? But anyway, when I was looking into this Corpus Hermetica, which would be basically the thought of the Hermes Trismegistus, but they were saying you need to try to cultivate Eusebia, which was awful close to the Arabian concept of Asabia in sounding. The name was almost the same, But this eusebia was sort of a respect, all admiration for the splendor and, of the universe, the whole grander picture. And in this idea of thinking, Hermetic thought the only true sin was the lack of this reverence. So in other words, if whoring's your thing, do all the whoring you want, but still get into the splendor, don't lose that. Don't lose sight of that. You get what I'm saying? And then apparently someday you might come off of those. And if you're lucky enough, get a little gnosis or whatever. So these, when I come across little things like the Hermetic thought, it makes me feel good, because remember what I told you, when something happened to me that was a 5-month long ordeal, it was hell at the time. I was like, man, I think he might have went crazy. But on the other hand, I was going, well, you know what? The information is so good, and I'm not being led in a way to go rob a bank or, do anything mischievous. So we're just going to roll with this. So that's when I tell you after the fact, I started trying to put a puzzle together of what the heck happened to me. And it was only through things like Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, certain kind of thinking where you can see, oh, that was par for the course. It's just that because we're Western, we're not programmed with that type of thinking.
What's that loud beep in the background? Is that the stove?
That's my oven trying to tell me that my Mexican lasagna is ready to be eaten, but I really wasn't done with Luke yet. So I just cut it off. I can deal with it. I was just
okay. Let me jump in with a thought. I don't believe for a second that our temperament and our passions and our fate are determined by the stars or even influenced by them. But I do recognize that many men and women get their sense of value from the quality of the men and women who pay attention to them or go to bed with them. So it's a very common way that men in particular get a sense of who they are by their ability to get attractive women into bed. It's a visceral driving force for a large number of men.
Mm-hmm. If you weren't 2,500 miles away, I'd invite you over for some Mexican lasagna. Sounds weird, doesn't it? That's one of these things you cook for 2 hours and then hope for the best. And we'll just see how it goes. Before we go, I noticed earlier, maybe a week or two ago, you were mentioning something about Hitler. And I don't know, maybe it's because he wasn't such a good author, but you were trying to flesh out some thoughts on Hitler. And I couldn't really, his book, I couldn't really stay with it. It was pretty boring. And the best I could remember, you were talking about, what the heck was his problem with the Jews or whatever. And, I remember, didn't he grow up somewhere like in Linz as a little kid? I remember him saying he only had one person in the neighborhood who was Jewish, and the kid was kind of weird, but he thought it was that kid that was weird. He didn't think that it was his Jewishness that necessarily made him weird or whatever. And then I remember before I put that book down, I guess he had at some point went to Vienna. And when he got to Vienna, he kept arguing with, I guess, Marxists or socialists that he thought were rabble-rousing. And he kept saying he would square them away one day, and they would go talk to somebody, and then come back the next day fired up with a whole different set of rhetoric that he would have to try to shake out of them. And then I remember him saying when he was in Vienna, I guess all the, like the vice, porn, or I guess it was prostitution and all the different things that he thought were like the corruptible influences. He kept finding a Jew at all these strings that he would pull at. And, right down to the point where, I don't know if it's at work sites or whatever, where they were getting this Marxist rhetoric, and he would try to diffuse it, and they would come back full of piss and vinegar the very next day with a whole nother angle, and so I don't know. It was probably at that point where I had gotten bored with the book, What was the burl in his saddle with Jews beyond that? What am I missing? Where did it amp up other than just he kind of saw them as being rabble rousers and kind of being merchants in the vices, and he didn't like that. What am I missing? Where did that level up from there?
Well, it was not something that he grew up with, right? He didn't grow up just hating Jews. It was something that he developed from his experiences in Vienna and from his reading. So he did not grow up and act like a Joseph Stalin. He wasn't a bank robber. He wasn't a hooligan. He wasn't living a particularly antisocial direction. He developed his thinking about Jews even reluctantly, according to him. Apparently, he was substantially influenced by the mayor of Vienna, who had some anti-Jewish views. But anyway, they came out of his life experiences and out of his reading. And he grew up reading a lot of Westerns where they would employ a certain type of logic where you're looking for the best available explanation for complicated phenomena. And so he developed from life experience and from his reading this thinking that the Jews were the best available explanation for much of life, that he found a problem. So he stumbled onto the Jews as the magic key for understanding the fate of Germany and the fate of Europe.
Yeah. Where I really have told you this before, but I think one thing that's not talked about enough is they lost a lot of their youth during World War I. You know, I imagine that was shocking to all of them. France, England, Germany, you know what I'm saying? And they were probably never on solid footing after that. But what's your gut feeling on this election now that we're just 48 hours away?
75% sure that Trump's going to win, which is pretty much where I've been for the past month.
Remember, I told you I keep thinking it comes down to, in many cases, like the workers versus the people who are like either not working or whose jobs are through the government, you know, either for the government or through the government. And, you know, it seems like Trump's going to have to win 70% of the workers, which you think he would, but you got to remember among the workers is teachers, you know, nurses, joggers working in municipalities, you know, here, there, and everywhere. So you would think he would get 70%, but he's not going to get all of them, you know, because there's just a core group that's programmed against everything he's about, you know. And then when you look at the other end of the people who aren't working, you probably got to hope he can maybe get 35-40% of those being retirees who maybe at one time did work or whatever, or just see that the nation isn't heading in the right direction. But yeah, I think that's 75. I would have thought you would have said higher, you know, just to be a little bit pessimistic, but it sounds like you're feeling pretty good.
Yeah, I do feel good. I got to run off. Good to talk to you, Kip.
Yeah, man. Sounds great. Talk to you next week.
Bye-bye. And there's a question in the chat here. If I ever bet on a political election, I don't believe I have. I quit betting in high school. I was like my Placer High School bookie. And then this guy repeatedly took me for hundreds and hundreds of dollars on horse racing. And I ended up paying him off $200 out of the, I don't know, $1,500 that I owed him because I was leaving the country. I said, here, let me just give you $200. Let's just call it quits. And I resolved then that I never wanted to bet again. And these types of excitement, such as the high that I would get from betting, they're not good for me, right? They are not a substance addiction. They are a process addiction to which I am keenly susceptible. On the other hand, I have been able to bet with other people's money for example, when I've been in Las Vegas and there's a woman who wanted me to gamble with her, and I told her, I can't gamble my own money anyway. She said, well, here's $20, just sit beside me, pull the slot machine. So I was able to do that without any problem, but I don't put my own money on the line with any gambling. Talk to you blokes later.